And good afternoon from the UAE as we officially open the fourth edition of the Public-Private Dialogue in conjunction with the IRENA Assembly. I'm John Devterius, the Emerging Markets Editor for CNN, who spends about half his time covering energy from the renewable space to hydrocarbons and then some. I would have to say most recently, particularly in the last couple of weeks, I've been spending a lot more of my time, about 75–80% of it, tracking Donald Trump and the business relations internationally during the second impeachment. It is a pleasure to welcome everyone in this dialogue for 2021, shall we say, under unusual circumstances with COVID-19 forcing us online for the events that take place around Abu Dhabi Sustainability Week. This is my fifth year of involvement during the annual event, and I don't believe we would have any disagreement from our participants from all around the world that the pandemic has accelerated an energy transition that was well underway. Just for perspective, I could see the stark difference of where we were 5 years ago and the pervasiveness in terms of the dialogue within the international oil and gas companies as well. We're being renamed, by the way, energy companies and not limited only to hydrocarbons, of course. The big difference is outside the energy community is that the general public, I think, could witness the difference when planes were parked because of the pandemic, cars were not moving, commerce grinding to a halt. And we saw the convergence with the damage to nature, of course, with the radical wildfires in Australia to California, record hurricanes in the Gulf Coast of the United States, and many other signals that really give us an indication of the urgency in which we need to move ahead of COP26. Now, our mission today is clear. What actions are needed to accelerate the pace of the energy transition, and how will those actions be impacted by the rising debt levels? I think it's worth me reminding our audience that we've seen an average rise in debted GDP during the pandemic of 20%, depending on the country. And they have to make plans for the near term and getting through the pandemic, of course, but medium term with the goals that we've set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. Before we bring in the Director General of IRENA, which I'm looking forward to listening to, I just wanted to remind everybody on the social media platforms, we're at hashtag IRENA11A. We're going to have a Q&A chat box. We invite you to participate and put your ideas and questions in there. I'm on my smartphone and I'll be fed some of the questions to bring forward in the dialogue segment of both session 1 and session 2. I just want to remind our speakers that we've indicated those participating in session 1 to limit themselves for 3 minutes. And it's extremely important because we want to do the Q&A session and invite input from the field, as I was suggesting. That kind of lays down the ground rules for the next hour or so together in the first session. I look forward to listening to Francesco La Camera, the Director General of IRENA, and thank him again for the invitation to chair for year 5. Francesco?
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me first of all to thank John for accepting to moderate this session here today. And I think this sign the now multi-annual friendship between John and IRENA, and I also wish to say to myself. So really thank for your work. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the 4th annual Public-Private Dialogue. The dialogue is becoming an important forum ahead of each year IRENA Assembly by bringing together public stakeholders and leading private and community players to identify key trends and priority action to driving energy transition. 1 year ago, we met in Abu Dhabi to discuss the challenges and scaling up of investment for a transition to high share of renewables. While the urgency of scaling up investment remains, much has changed in the last 12 months. The COVID-19 pandemic had unprecedented impacts on the society and economies. The energy sector is no exception. The fossil fuel industries have been hit especially hard, aligning the cost of a China economy to the fate of fuel prone to price shocks. The very real challenges facing healthcare system with unreliable energy access were magnified. All vulnerability we were aware of become obvious and invisible. At the same time, renewable-based systems have proven to be comparatively more resilient. 2020 has signaled the urgent need to accelerate shift towards an energy system based on renewable energy. In this regard, the insight of the IRENA Coalition on COVID-19's impact on the ground have been invaluable to shaping both the global discourse on energy transition and the energy work. In today's first session, we will hear from leading industry association how the renewable energy industry has been impacted by and responded to the crisis. They will also share their perspective on the next steps in ensuring that renewables technologies growth at speed that do support both the recovery and medium and long-term objective and climate objective. Ladies and gentlemen, we all recognize that economic stimulus packages and investment put forward by the public and private sectors today will shape the economy and society for decades. IRENA post-COVID recovery agenda calls for an accelerated uptake of renewables and energy efficiency, along with enabling infrastructure and innovation to spur recovery that is resilient, inclusive, and sustainable in the long term. Several governments announced ambitious climate commitments, including concrete actions to support renewables, but many others have yet to act. The IRENA Coalition for Action recently renewed its call to action to governments to revisit their recovery packages and measures and adjust the course of a green recovery. We need to see the same adjustment in the broader energy industry. There are new signs emerging. Some leading oil and gas companies have started to engage in renewables and energy transitions. We will hear from some of these actors today. The transformation of the global energy system will only happen if governments and the private sector work hand in hand. In the second section, we will discuss how these concerted efforts can accelerate the energy transition and ensure no one is left behind, including workers and communities. I firmly believe that COVID-19 has emerged as a game changer for the energy sector. We, the renewable energy community, have grown together to overcome unparalleled challenges. We are larger in numbers, clear in the approach, and mindful of the barrier to overcome. We are shifting towards an energy system that needs additional players and different mindsets. Government representatives, legislators, the private sector, civil society, citizens, all can and must take part in driving action toward a resilient, equitable, and inclusive energy system. I remain convinced that the quest for a renewable-based energy transition will succeed. We see a new momentum emerging amidst the harsh reality of the pandemic. This gives me confidence that a new energy system is within reach. Today's event will not only possible without the tireless efforts of members of the IRENA Coalition for Action and the Legislative Forum. I would like to express my deep gratitude to your continuous engagement and contribution. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm looking forward for today's discussion. Thank you very much, and back to you, John. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Francesco, and thanks for the kind words to start off 2021 here at IRENA. It's always appreciated. Some of the things that stood out for me there in your conversation, you said an energy transition that is both inclusive and equitable. And this is something that has emerged, in fact, over the last 10, 12 months of this pandemic, that we want to make the energy transition. Capital needs to be made available, but we have to think it through to make sure it's also good economically and sound jobs come out of it, lasting jobs, as I think Joe Biden said during the campaign. I'd like to now introduce Kingsmill Bond, the energy strategist at the Carbon Capture Initiative, the Carbon Tracker Initiative, rather, and to give a scene-setting presentation. The Carbon Tracker Initiative is a nonprofit financial think tank that carries out in-depth analysis on the impact of the energy transition on capital markets there. Kingsman, I've known you for ages, so sorry about getting the title wrong, Carbon Tracker Initiative. But I'd love to get your thoughts here on the momentum that Francesco was talking about here. I know you're doing a scene-setting presentation, but there's kind of a widely held belief that we saw great correction in emissions, but that we may go back to business as usual. Do you agree or disagree with this idea that we just snap back and put growth at all costs at the top of that priority list?
Thank you very much, John, for asking me the question. Just briefly to respond to that, the way to think about this is like pushing a rock over a hill. What COVID has done is it's enabled the rock to get pushed over the top of the hill, and now we're moving down the other side, and actually it's a very, very different environment. So I don't think there's any question of a snapback of the rock going back up the hill, because actually we've moved into a new world, a new order.
Great. Okay, good. We look forward to your insights, because everybody's trying to figure out whether this money is still funneling into the renewable sector or not, and at which level. We can see that the equity markets are ahead of the curve here and jumping in full force, particularly in the last 6 months, and kind of rushing out of the hydrocarbon players who are just pure play oil and gas. Tell us what your presentation suggests here going forward.
Fine. So I think maybe if it's possible to start the presentation with the opening slide, please. First of all, as I say, thank you very much to Francesco for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of Carbon Tracker, which is a think tank which has been focusing on the energy transition on financial markets for about 10 years now. And I'm here with a great message, I think, of hope and opportunity in the midst of the pain and the suffering caused by COVID, because COVID has brought forward the peak of demand for fossil fuels and made possible a much more rapid energy transition, which can save us all from the still greater catastrophe of unabated global warming, and furthermore unleash a new era of cheap distributed energy available to all. In short, the economics means that it's now in your own self-interest to take a new path. So very quickly to lay out the argument, this technology revolution is upon us. At heart, this energy transition is from fossil fuels to renewables is a technology revolution, as highlighted by IRENA's brilliant work on renewable costs. It started in electricity, it's now disrupting transportation, and it's moving right across the energy complex. And technology revolutions, to remind you, have got three key characteristics. First of all, technology costs fall on well-established learning curves for every doubling in capacity. So for example, solar's been falling by 40% from IRENA's numbers, wind by 30%, batteries by 31%. Secondly, new technologies grow very rapidly on exponential growth curves as they get cheaper than fossil fuel technologies. Again, solar's been growing at 38% a year over the last decade, batteries at 50% a year. And thirdly, change is absolutely relentless and unstoppable, like the tide. And as Doyne Farmer of Oxford University has shown us, learning curves are very sticky. Next slide, please. So the consequence of this very rapid growth in new technologies is peaking demand for fossil fuels. So if we could have the next slide that I could show that. Thank you. So this was foreseen by forecasters such as DNVGL or McKinsey. It's perfectly normal, actually. And it happens to all slow growth incumbents when confronted by a rapidly growing challenger. And to be clear, energy is a very slow growth system, growing at around 1% a year. So before COVID, even before COVID, many forecasters were already forecasting peak fossil fuel demand at the end of the 2020s. Next slide, please. So what's the impact of COVID? And this now starts to answer John's question of, are we going to go back? The impact of COVID has been to bring forward that expected peak in fossil fuel demand by a decade to 2019. And at heart, this is just simple maths. When cyclical shocks strike a low growth system near its structural peak, they bring forward the date of peak demand for the old technology because they wipe out several years of growth. And by the time the old demand returns to its previous level, all of the growth is coming from the new technology. And this is not theory, that's exactly what happened to the electricity system in Europe in the 2008 financial crisis. Demand for coal and gas to generate electricity peaked in 2007 and has never recovered. This is what DNV now forecasts, for example, for the energy system as a whole. They brought forward their forecast for peak fossil fuel demand from 2028 to 2019. And I deliberately am using here a graph from an oil company, from BP. Even the oil companies are now beginning to wake up and realize what's going on. In 2019, as this chart shows, BP, for example, saw no peak in oil demand. In 2020, they noted that 2019 was probably the peak of demand and highlighted that demand might fall very quickly. Next slide, please. Not merely has this pushed the technology over the curve, as it were, it's also sparked a policy reset. So between, as we all know, September and November of 2020, we saw a radical change. As first China, and then Japan, and Korea, and then the United States committed to net zero policy. So we now have a situation where leaders of 63% of the world have committed to net zero by the middle of the century. Furthermore, last year saw a tripling of the number of companies which have signed up to the net zero pledge, and investors with $52 trillion of assets have now signed up to the Carbon Action 100 Plus program to drive change in fossil fuel intensive stocks. Initiatives to drive disclosure and change, such as the TCFD and the NGFS, also took off in 2020. So it really has been an absolute reset year. Next slide, please. And what this therefore means is that the 2020s will be the decade of fossil fuel peaks. So to remind you, the last decade saw one peak after the other, in the same way as you get pre-shocks before an earthquake. Peak fossil fuels in the OECD actually in 2005, peak coal in 2013, peak ICE cars in 2017. It's highly likely, as we've noted, we've seen peak fossil fuels in 2019 and peak emissions. The 2020s, therefore, are the decade when everything else peaks. Peak Chinese oil demand, peak Indian coal demand, peak ICE trucks, peak fossil fuels for steel, and so on and so forth. And on a more positive note, this is also the decade for continued exponential renewables growth. Next slide, please. Why is it that peaks matter so much? As every investor knows, peaks mean financial market disruption. They mean losses for investors in incumbent industries because they face falling demand and falling prices at a time of overcapacity. And they also mean rapid exponential growth for challenging companies building new industries. And this is an absolutely clear and well-established pattern over the last decade that we've been looking at in Carbon Tracker, European electricity, global coal, oil services. They've all seen exactly this pattern, which is now spreading right across the energy complex. Next slide, please. So starting to draw this little presentational scene setting to a conclusion. This is the data for energy policy stimulus from Energy Policy Tracker as of a couple of days ago. So given the background of peaking fossil fuel system about to enter terminal decline, it is astonishing that half of the energy sector stimulus money has gone into the fossil fuel sector. I would suggest that a lot of that will turn out to be wasted capital, a bit like Trump's attempts to prop up the US coal sector or the many attempts to save Nokia. It's a waste of capital. At the same time, it's very positive that actually 1/3 of this stimulus money has gone into green energy, according to Energy Policy Tracker. So it's not the same as 2008. People are thinking already very differently. So let me come to my final slide. Next slide, please. What is the verdict of the markets? To conclude with my own area of expertise of financial markets. Financial markets price the future. People are paid to understand what's going to happen over the next 20 years. 2020 was the year that investors really woke up to what is happening, and the future they see is one of decline for fossil fuels and growth for renewables. And you can demonstrate this in many ways. You can think about the 8-fold increase in the share price of Tesla versus the halving of the share price of Exxon, or in more prosaic terms, the doubling of the S&P Clean Energy Index versus the halving of the S&P Energy Index. And financial markets themselves then drive change. As they remove capital from dying industries, it becomes harder for them to raise money for expansion. And as they allocate capital to growth industries, so companies find it easier to grow. Tesla can raise $5 billion in an afternoon, and solar developers could borrow money at 1%. So what does this mean then for policymakers to conclude? It means that you will struggle to raise money to build a new coal plant, but put in place a sound regulatory environment and an auction system, and the world will beat a path to your door to build renewable energy systems. Now, I would suggest is the moment to seize the opportunity to take advantage of these new technologies and bring clean energy to your people. Thank you, and back to you, John.
Great, Kingsmill, thanks very much. Boy, you put some very interesting analysis into this, and you talked about the two scenarios for oil and gas. I've seen a number of different ones out in the market, the BP annual report, but you have to 2040 below 70 million barrels a day and just above 50 million barrels a day in that time frame. So that's less than 20 years. And 63% of the countries now have declared net zero by 2050. Some said they can even accelerate it. And the one that stood out for me the most, Kingsmill, was and I think it shouldn't surprise me that much because we've seen all this in the news on a kind of daily basis, that companies have tripled in terms of the number that have committed to net zero by 2050 with, again, because of the technology breakthroughs, the aspirations to actually beat that target as well. Kingsmill is going to stay with us for through the duration of this session, and hopefully we have time to ask for his summary inputs there as well, an analysis where we're going to be hearing from the different trade associations. It's excellent in the convening power of IRENA that it can pull together all the different associations across the spectrum of renewable energy. And this has been an extraordinary year because of the COVID-19 pandemic, shocks to different areas of the sector, and then the spotlight showing on to others, kind of their moment to grow in the future, as Kingsmill was talking about here, with the finance ready to back it. Let me introduce our panel just briefly here, and then call upon a question for each one of them. Jose Donoso is the chair of the Global Solar Council. Ben Backwell is the CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council. Marit Bromer is executive director of the International Geothermal Association. Eddie Rich is the CEO of International Hydropower Association. Remy Gruet is the CEO of the Ocean Energy Group in Europe. And Bharadwaj Kumamaru is executive director of the World Bioenergy Association. And just a wholehearted welcome back to IRENA, and hopefully better times ahead in 2021, particularly for this segment of the market. Jose, I'd like to start with you because of what we saw in 2020 and the challenges for solar energy, but also kind of a testing point because of the backup and reliability that it provided. What did you think we learned in this process during the pandemic, plus and minus, and what can we carry forward here in the recovery phases after the vaccine distribution reaches also the developing world at the same time? Jose?
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much to IRENA to give me the possibility to participate in this round table. I think we learned many things in this pandemic in all the sense, but particularly from the PV, we discover how resilient is our sector to this circumstance. But that's not avoid that in a survey that our association organized in the whole world between 500 enterprises, we'll discover that the 70% of the companies or his orders fall by up to fall, but more of the 50% of his orders. But we showed that the other half of the sector was resilient. We discovered that, for instance, in my original country, in Spain, with we produced a shock of demand, as in the most of the countries, and that's produced in the markets where the one participation of the renewables more or less in the average of the 75%, and that produced one reduction in the price, in the final price of the electricity, of more of 1/3. This means in the future how much PV, how much renewables we have a cheaper electricity, that is clear. But from our sector, we define what we needed to assure that. What future where we have this cheap electricity, but at the same time, we produce economical growing, we produce employments, and we consider that the government, what they can do in this circumstance, in first place, is long-term strategic plans to give stability to the sector, to give to the sector legal certainty, and to reduce permitting times. There is another thing that we discovered is that the willingness of the private investor to invest in PV will continue. All the projects that have been, the most of the project will continue ahead. They only postpone for some months, some year, but the willingness of investor, the private investor, is there and continue to be there. But that they need is that the government work in the administrative simplification. All the time, if we need to wait 1 month, 1 year more, this means 1 year more emitting CO2, 1 year more with people that could be employment without employment. Then reduced bureaucracy must be a priority for all the governments. If the governments, obviously every national circumstances are different, but if the governments will promote more the sector that can have this impact positive in the green recovery, that must be one priority to work in renewables, because it's a structural measure. Is what this cheap electricity for the future. They can do now is tax reliefs for the project, particularly a small project, particularly for self-consumption project, tax relief, loans, that allow to this part of the sector to ahead. That I consider that must be the priority the government can do to help or to promote more quickly the renewables in this moment that can have this strong impact, positive, strong impact in the economy at the global level.
Thank you, Jose Donoso of the Global Solar Council, and the urging of governments here to kind of set the framework and the policies to encourage this development. Over the last year and during the pandemic, I had a chance to go up to Aberdeen, kind of witness firsthand the offshore wind market there, and something that I covered from the oil and gas perspective, making that transition to offshore wind was pretty extraordinary to watch, and the adaptation of companies to actually serve that sector. Let's bring in Ben Backwell, the CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council. And Ben, you know, we often talk about the global supply chain and the breaks in it. We've had the challenges, of course, because of Brexit, but a slower growth. How has this impacted the sector? What did we learn out of that process here in terms of deliverables just in time on such a crucial sector through this crisis that we've been through?
Good afternoon, John, and thank you for the question. Thank you, Director General, as well, for the invitation today. It's good to see you all. So the supply chain for wind was massively impacted in the first quarter of 2019, particularly in kind of key production hubs in China, in India, and also in places in Europe, such as Denmark and Spain. And then was able to recover quite quickly as the industry was able to kind of agree operating guidelines with governments. And as an association, we spent a lot of time in the first half of the year working with local associations and governments to try and create sensible guidelines so people could continue to work. And that meant that by Q2, for instance, most of Asia, in particular China, was actually up and running normally again. We also saw on a project level that people changed guidelines and innovated to be able to keep project installations going. So for instance, John, you mentioned offshore wind in Aberdeen. So offshore wind crews, for instance, had longer rotations so that we weren't swapping over crews and exposing people to the virus. And that meant that these kind of very large projects were able to keep going. At the beginning of the year, GWEC predicted something like a 20% fall from the original forecast, which was going to be a very big year. And by the end of the year, we were very pleased to see that actually it was only 6% less than our original big forecast. And in fact, offshore wind had surpassed the forecast by 5%. So it's a real show of resilience. I think it's really exciting to see how many people are coming into the sector. We'd already seen this before COVID, but I think as Kingsmill pointed out, it really feels like a tipping point now. And we're seeing the large companies in GWEC, for instance, becoming kind of renewables super majors, where their capex becomes actually greater than the old oil and gas majors. And I think our kind of top level point here is that the challenge we face is not a challenge of not enough money anymore. And in fact, it hasn't been for quite a while. Wind and solar are the big investment themes on capital markets and on equity markets. The problem we face is actually not enough projects which are bankable and agreed and permitted to allow us to invest all this money at the speed that we need to be going at. So this year, for instance, will be a record year of 78 gigawatts installed for the wind industry, but we probably need to be installing about double that per year to get to where IRENA thinks we need to get to in 2030 and 2050. So we really need to double our annual run rate and keep that going between now and 2050. So it's you know, it's still quite a mountain to climb. And the big question here is not so much investment appetite, but actually government permitting and market schemes that allow us to actually be able to go and build at the speed we need to be building at. So I'll leave it at that. But we are extremely excited about this year ahead, leading up to COP and seeing all these net zero commitments being made and seeing all these companies want to come into our sector and join us. So thank you.
Good. Ben, just very quickly, within 20 seconds quickly, you talked about this doubling of capacity, and it's kind of the same or similar tune that we see in every sector right now. There's growth taking place, there's money being generated, as Kingsmill was talking about. Do you have the capacity in the industry to grow that fast if the equity is there?
Yeah, we think we do, because remember, we have actually been operating at below capacity. The factories and the supply chain has been operating for the last 5-6 years at well below capacity. And we also have shown time and time again that when we need to ramp up, we can. The question is, when there's that visibility in terms of projects and pipeline, companies will invest very, very quickly in new installations. And we see that around the world. Okay, thanks a lot for being brief on that. Let's bring in Marit Bromer, the Executive Director of the International Geothermal Association. I think most people that are kind of tuning into IRENA here for the first time from different parts around the world, Marit, would not be too surprised, perhaps, what's been built over. But this is one sector of the market that is not appreciated, I think, to the 14 gigawatts that you have established in terms of capacity in 2019. Has been steady growth for a number of years. I know this from firsthand from people who enjoy geothermal to heat their homes, the efficiency of it and the rest. Has the COVID-19 pandemic created new opportunities, do you think, for geothermal vis-a-vis if we had this conversation even 3 years ago?
Thank you very much for that question, and also John for pinpointing one of our biggest challenges, and that is our invisibility. We always say we are the hidden champion of the energy transition, and I am convinced that this is also our decade. Francisco La Cámara, Director General, I thank you as well for hosting this session, and I thank everyone for allowing geothermal to speak here today. It is absolutely crucial that we gain visibility for geothermal, and I come to your question in a sec, John, but please, the topic of today is really about how COVID has impacted us in general in terms of geothermal, but also to give us hope for accelerating the growth that we indeed see very much within geothermal in the coming decade. Your question, John, is about how exactly COVID impacted us even not being on track prior to COVID. And yes, we have been hit hard. We were not considered to be on track in terms of our predictions to the coming 5 and 10 years. And COVID has impacted us a lot in terms of the raised capital for geothermal to be put online. We saw, and the data need to be confirmed obviously in Q1, but we saw a meager 200 megawatts being put online in the year 2020, as opposed to the 1.1 gigawatts that we were hopefully be seeing. But COVID in terms of its opportunities, and that's the pandemic that has hit the message home that buildings, our houses, our cities, and the way we are producing food around the globe has significantly put a spotlight on geothermal, both for our communities worldwide, in terms of our associations working on multiple, let's say, facets of geothermal, not just for electricity and power plants, but also for heating and cooling of homes, houses, and district energy systems. We see a call of smart cities, and especially their mayors and their policies, around understanding that heating and cooling for those countries who are more in need of cooling, that centralized solution offered by geothermal could be actually a game changer. Because as we always have been saying for a long time together with IRENA, IEA, and the REN21 think tank, more than 50% of our energy consumption sits in the demand for heating and cooling. And as the IEA points out, 99% of that is fossil fuel based. If we want to reach Paris Agreement, if we want to build a net zero future, we need to tackle heating and cooling. And as you quite rightly said so, John, in the beginning of your conversation, is that it was electricity first, transport is now the target, but I am convinced that this decade will see geothermal hitting the message home that we need collectively build a sustainable heating and cooling system. And geothermal can become a huge player in that. Secondly, what we've seen, and this is really what I like, Kingsmill, what you said about re-rating renewables and the marriage of oil and gas companies trying to rebrand their names, sometimes even literally, as in Statoil becoming Equinor, but also the BP and small capitals now saying that indeed, these are stranded assets. Fossil fuels are stranded assets, and we want to be carbon neutral in 2050, and hence divesting in oil and investing in renewables. Now, why does that matter to geothermal? A large part of our business, and this is also becoming a very crucial element of policy making, is the leaving no one behind for the developing countries, but also our skilled workforce when it comes down to drilling. We have so many drill rigs standing idle in 2020, and geothermal is promising enough in order to allow not only the skilled workforce to hop over and transfer, instead of drilling for oil, drilling for heat. And what we see is, hopefully in 21, but definitely in the coming years, with a reunited focus on baseload power when it comes down to the electricity game, but also for heating and clean heat for smart cities, where we see a strong marriage from oil and gas companies who are leading their skilled workforce to drill and to produce clean energy to serve the Paris Agreement in the 30 years to come. Thank you very much for this intervention.
Yeah, Merit, that was excellent. And thanks very much. I never really would have thought about the same skills you can use for oil and gas exploration you can apply, as you suggested, to geothermal, which is interesting. I'm sure Ben would weigh in that we saw that same transition in many parts of the world from oil and gas, and also doing the same when it comes to offshore wind in particular, which I had a chance to, as I suggested, to witness firsthand. Before I bring in Eddie Rich of the International Hydro Power Association, I just want to flag with the Director General. I want to call on him after Eddie to see how the narrative has changed with the dialogue between IRENA, DG, and the governments. Do they feel overwhelmed in a sense? We have 7 different associations all kind of knocking on the door and saying, you know, it's our time for our segment of the market, and our government's being sophisticated enough to pick and choose what actually works in their own countries. Give it some thought, Francesco, please, and I'll come back to you after Eddie's intervention. This is a hydropower, Eddie. What did we learn during the pandemic here, and the demand for hydropower, where it's available in certain countries, as I was suggesting, around the world?
Well, thanks, John. Can I ask you to start off by closing your eyes and let me take you back to the 5th of April last year. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi has just called for Indians to switch off their lights for 9 minutes at 9 p.m. To express solidarity amid the COVID pandemic. And the result, John, is the largest electricity experiment the world's ever seen. That night, there was a fall in demand of over 31 gigawatts. So that's equivalent to the entire power demand of Pakistan. So that move obviously presented a huge challenge for power operators, and they're the ones charged with managing the grid stability with that huge ramp down. And as the country reached closer to those turning those lights off, the hydropower generation was maximized. When people began switching lights off, then hydropower generation was quickly reduced from 26 gigawatts down to 8 gigawatts to match that demand reduction. So thanks to hydropower's flexibility, the stations were then able to ramp up within seconds and restore the electricity to tens of millions of households, switching the lights back on. So amongst us energy nerds, that hydropower there was fated as India's rock star. There have been less extreme versions of this experiment. You can open your eyes now. Less extreme versions of this experiment, which have happened all over the world in more protracted versions across during COVID. And hydropower has been able to keep the lights on, to support essential health services, water management, data centers, transportation of goods. And it's saved lives, it's kept people employed, it's provided low energy, clean energy, and supported the other, the variable renewables. So as Director General LaCamera and Kingsman Bond described, COVID has been a game changer for renewables, and that's right. 2020 has been a sort of case study in how hydropower can provide flexibility and stability to the grid system under extreme circumstances. The lesson, John, for the longer term is that hydropower has a big role to play to support the rapid rollout of variable renewables and the phasing out of fossil fuels under green recovery packages. I'm looking at this panel and I'm thinking wind and solar should be, and I'm sure you all are, our biggest cheerleaders. According to IRENA, the world needs an additional 850 gigawatts of newly installed hydropower capacity by 2050. Building green, clean, affordable hydropower is an imperative. But making it happen, it takes conscious action. It won't just be a boulder running down the hill. And why is that? It's because the market at the moment doesn't properly incentivize and value storage and grid stability. It's focused almost entirely on energy generation. And I mean, I see that resonating with biothermals and geothermals as well. There are some good examples in the US. The stimulus packages provides an extension of tax credits for hydropower facilities and increased funding for research and development in hydropower. A new bipartisan bill also proposes new tax credits for investment in energy storage, including pumped storage. And similarly in the Philippines, we've seen an indefinite extension of feed-in tariff incentives provided for hydropower projects. And John, as you were asking, there are huge opportunities. There is growing interest from institutional investors and financiers in hydropower and pumped storage. The Australia National University has identified over 600,000 sites around the world that are topologically appropriate for offshore or off-river pumped storage. There are also similar opportunities to complement hydropower with floating solar. More importantly, with the landmark collaboration agreement between environmental groups and the US hydropower sector, there's a strong commitment by the hydropower industry and environmental NGOs to work together to tackle climate change while preserving healthy rivers. And this involves retrofitting some of the 97% of non-powered dams in the country whilst decommissioning others. So we also see huge opportunities for refurbishing or modernizing existing hydropower facilities. We did a study, studies in Asia and in Latin America, and identified $8 billion of investment opportunities to massively improve energy efficiency in those regions. Okay. Finally, after decades of engagement with environmental and social NGOs, governments and investors, we've learned and collectively agreed on what is good practice and best practice for sustainability in the sector. We're just about to launch a global standard for sustainability. So I would say in 2021, there is absolutely no excuse for hydropower development not to meet at least good practices in sustainability. And that's what we as IHA would expect of our members. So just to say, my message today is that the crisis has underlined hydropower's resilience and its critical role in delivering and supporting clean, reliable and affordable energy. And it's vital that appropriate policy and regulatory frameworks are in place to properly value the essential services that sustainable hydropower provides in respect of storage and grid stability and other critical areas. Given the long lead times of large-scale infrastructure projects, if we are going to meet those climate targets, investment decisions need to happen now, John. So we are urging governments and policymakers across the world, distinguished participants in this event, to start planning now for the flexible grids of the future that will support the integration of variable renewables with reliable and flexible solutions like hydropower. So thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Eddie, for the comprehensive discussion you brought forward there with that number of 850 gigawatts standing out to 2050 in terms of capacity. You were suggesting just one area. Francesco, I did lay out a question for you, and that is the government framework. We have 7 participants here in the discussion, and are governments being sophisticated and responsive enough, knowing what we've faced over the last year, to accelerate the framework of their policies to encourage investment into these 7 different sectors? We don't have too much time, but I'd love to get the feedback you're hearing from governments themselves to set up the right frameworks that we've been talking about here. Each one of our speakers have talked about it so far.
Thank you, John. Yes, what I can say that our sense is, and it is what I have to say from the start of the crisis, where IRENA voiced that the pandemic was going to impact all the economies, but no so strong the renewables. And the fact is, from seeing my friends here in the screen and what I have seen, and show that we were right on that. And when we came also with our agenda on the post-COVID, we have received many interest, very much interest from governments. We are working with many of them. We are supporting 70 countries on reviewing their commitment towards the COP26. What is important, what we are trying to work with the government, making clear that it's not just going from one fuel to another. So we are not going just from fossil fuel to renewables. We are going to a different system that makes many things changing. So this is important. It's what we are trying to make clear with all governments. But the data, the number that Kingsmill gave us make clear that there is a strong sense that the next year or the next years will be very, very accelerating the path to renewables. And if I can say comment, these people all around the screen make clear as renewables is not just solar, it's not wind, it's not geothermal, it's not hydropower or bioenergy, it's all together. It's something new that is happening and will change our way to live in better, to the better.
Okay, thanks, Francesco. Thanks for taking that question. Mara talked about the geothermal challenge, kind of hidden there as the secret weapon in the world. And I know if we think about ocean power energy generation, it's not been easy to generate the investment, particularly during the pandemic. Let's bring in Remy Grouet, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Ocean Energy Europe. Do you have any particular challenges vis-a-vis somebody like Merit right now, Remy, to get the momentum here and not see the pandemic as a roadblock, but opening up another opportunity perhaps?
Yes, thank you, John. Thank you, Francesco, for having us. The impacts of COVID on ocean energy have been very similar to the impacts on other renewables. We had delays in project installations for obvious reasons. We had difficulty for less mature projects, indeed, to answer your question, to find private investors. money has become less available because it has become less risk friendly. Like Ben said, it's not that there is no money, it's just it's going in crisis areas, in crisis moments towards things that are more secure, like for example, wind and solar. Despite all of that, we had a fairly good year, I would say, in 2020 for ocean energy. We had many projects hitting the water, some of them that had been financed already in Canada, in the Shetlands. Verdun Power put 3 devices in New York. Minesto had a power purchase agreement in the Faroe Islands. We had the Danish company Wave Piston installing in Spain. CIMIC Atlantis exporting to China and Japan. Their last turbine actually just arrived in December in Nagasaki. And we've seen also companies building factories, which is a first in ocean energy. Core Power in Portugal, Minesto in Wales, their factories to produce a larger number of turbines rather than just building a few in a workshop in a shipyard. And to go back to finance, really we've seen a shift already. We have private investment going into the sector. CIMIC Atlantis has just signed for £12 million private investment into their own company. But we've seen crowdfunding, and this also to answer one of the questions I saw pass by on the chat. Crowdfunding has become a very significant source of capital for the industry. Several companies have had successful campaigns enabling them to finance further developments. And this is becoming a real significant source. Now, looking to 2021 and beyond, we have a number of projects lined up. A lot of those who didn't happen in 2020 will actually happen in 2021. We haven't actually had cancellations, we've just had delayed projects. And also politically, there is a new momentum we can see for wave and tidal, specifically ocean energy in general. The US is keeping their investment. They have roughly invested $100 million per year in the last 6-7 years. China keeps investing as well. In Europe, Spain, Ireland, and Portugal have announced new targets for wave energy. In the UK, the Secretary of State, newly elected, in fact, is considering new revenue support mechanisms for ocean energy. And last but certainly not least, the European Commission has launched in November last year its offshore renewable energy strategy. And that document is pledging for Europe to put grant, loan, equity finance behind 100 megawatts of ocean energy projects by 2025. So this is not 2050 promises. This is immediate kickstart money for the sector. And this is money that governments will also be able to benefit from, because the projects they will have in their country can access that finance. So we're currently working with the Commission on a pipeline of projects to make these 100 megawatts happen, which obviously seems very little compared to what wind or solar are achieving, but we've all been there at the start, and this is where tidal is at the moment. Which brings me to my last point. And the one action that governments really can take now to accelerate a renewable-based green recovery on ocean energy is revenue support. Whether it's a feed-in tariff, whether it's a CFD in the UK, like in the UK, whether it's auctions, whether it's even a power purchase agreement with a leading utility, it doesn't really matter. The fact is that all pilot farms we've seen put in the water have been made in areas and on the basis of some form of revenue support scheme. All countries that have put these schemes in place have seen private investors putting money into projects. It's China, it's Canada, it's the Canaries, the Shetland, the Faroe, just for last year. Some are island markets for the future. In the UK and France have also projects that are very promising and underpinned by PPA deals. So you can still finance prototypes and smaller projects with large grants, and certainly in the area of wave, where we're still developing prototypes, this will still be required. But the industry, and specifically the tidal industry, is ready now for project finance, for private investments, potentially still including grants, but with deployments that are supported by revenue scheme. So this is my key action and message to governments based on the good build out and developments of the last year.
Okay, Remy, very quickly, that was very interesting. You mentioned some of the amount of money that are going into different parts of the world. What are the fastest 2 growing regions in the world for the technology, would you say? Who's committed to it in terms of the volume of the deals and the investment projects? Okay, it depends on your definition of a region. Canada is certainly at the moment one of the leading regions or countries, because they have both a feed-in tariff in place from Nova Scotia, and they also have a grant scheme
from the government that can add on top of that and help reach companies reach financial close. In Europe, we see several markets that are promising as well. For tidal, specifically in the US, there is a great way of a great wealth of activity around wave. So it depends a bit where, and to be honest, we are at an early stage of development. So I want to say, going into the future, the region that's going to have the best deployment rates is the region that's going to have a financial package that make investors see it as a potential market. It's just as simple as that. We have technologies that are readily deployable now in tidal specifically. You put the market together, they will flock. ENI, the oil and gas company, has just pledged to invest into 12 megawatts of wave. I mean, wave again being less developed, it's really a significant signal that there is a shift in mentalities when it comes to investments.
Okay, Remy, thanks for being brief and direct there. Just to do some management here for our team from IRENA as well. We're 5 minutes to the hour. I think we'll conclude this fairly with Bhadaraj by 5 past. He has 4 minutes for his presentation. I want to circle back to Kingsmill to get his analysis of what we had to hear. And we had one question for him on the chat. I just want to encourage our other 7 panelists as well. Join the chat if you'd like and answer some of the questions that are there while we get through the last 10 minutes of our session here. Let's bring in Bhadaraj Kumamaru, who of the World Bioenergy Association, with a presence in 65 countries. What would you say? You've heard the conversation from 6 others, Bhadaraj. How does this resonate with you in the biofuel space and the demand for it, and emerging markets, which I know are showing interest, particularly in a place like India? Please.
Perfect. First of all, thank you, John, and also thank you to the Director General, Francisco Lacamera, and IRENA for inviting the World Bioenergy Association for this very interesting session. First, looking at the pandemic and the impact it had in the bioenergy sector, I kind of resonate with the comments made by other panelists as well, that the spread of the virus and the various measures taken by the governments, including lockdowns and social distancing guidelines, etc., had a significant impact on the development of the bioenergy sector, including biofuels, biogas, solid biomass. And we did a survey last year among our industry representatives, including equipment manufacturers, technology developers, biofuel producers, and that showed that the majority of them have indicated that they feel moderate to severe impact on their businesses. And this includes drop in production, drop in revenues, delay in investment decisions, but also challenges to access site to operate, install, and maintain equipment. So it was a bit challenging. And the biggest challenge we've heard and we've seen was the low oil prices. Even though we've heard of that, there was a similar situation a couple of years back, 2015-16, where we did have these low oil prices. But this time it was coupled with the drop in energy demand and drop in fuel demand, which was a bigger challenge for, say, the liquid biofuels industry to cope up. But at the same time, on a positive note, many of the responses from the industry, but also the statements they put out during the pandemic and later on by the end of the year, showed incredible innovation and resilience. Once, for an example, there were some of the companies which were able to switch to different products, say from producing liquid biofuels to, say, hand sanitizers, even though the demand for both is quite different. But also, for example, the wood pellet industry, say in the US, was also quite resilient. Mainly, they benefited with long-term offtake agreements and long-term stable policies, and they were able to continue production as such. So there was also a positive lining on that. So overall, at the end of the year, what was the impact? It's still too early to know. But we are looking ahead right now from 2021, which I think Kingsmill has pointed out quite well, is a challenging year and also a challenging decade for solving these global climate and energy challenges. But the industry has informed that they're quite ready to meet the increasing demand for, I think how Eddie and Marit have pointed out, for dispatchable, renewable, clean energy, and not just electricity, but also heat and transportation fuels. So the industry is quite ready, and this is due to the availability of, say, new and existing type of feedstock, the drop in cost of technologies for bioenergy, but also the various multiple socioeconomic benefits that bioenergy brings in, which IRENA has pointed out in many of the reports already. So at the end of the day, if you have to give like a message to the policymakers for as an opportunity for the industry to deliver, Of course, there are quite a number of things to say, but the most important thing is to set the right regulatory and political framework. These include, say, feed-in tariffs or subsidies, reducing subsidies to fossil fuels, feed-in tariff and other kind of support for renewable energy technologies. But if I have to point out one key action, that would be, say, sitting here in Sweden, in Stockholm, that would be setting a price on carbon. It doesn't have to be $150 per ton, but start now, start slow, but make sure that you put a price on carbon. So anyway, in terms of regions, we see a lot of developments happening outside Europe, East Asia, for example, in Japan and South Korea, a lot of developments happening in Africa, in South America, in the liquid power fuel sector. So look, in 2021 and beyond looks quite bright for the bioenergy sector. So just to conclude, again, we commend the work done by IRENA and as the industry representative for the bioenergy sector, pleased to work with the policymakers to ensure that we have this energy transformation.
Great, Bhadraj, thanks a lot, and thanks for doing a nice summary there at the end of the panelists. Kingswell, I said I wanted to circle back to you. I see you're still with us. We had a couple of questions. One, which you answered online, the regulatory and fiscal monetary policy changes that are required. And we had a question about, there's no doubt COVID-19 changed kind of the finance industry in the pressure to deal with the climate targets and doing so most efficiently. Can we weave that in with ESG pressure that's coming now from the major investment funds around the world who basically said, we're not going to fund hydrocarbons anymore? And can this have a positive influence on the question number 2 that was presented to you on the chat? Can this put pressure on the governments to get the right fiscal framework and the business models here that were talked about by all 7 of the associations? What do you think?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that raises some extremely important issues. So ESG is a powerful driver, as you say. The amount of ESG funds has increased very significantly during the course of 2020, but we shouldn't take our eyes off the observation that financial market actors follow the opportunity and the money, and what that means is that as they see better opportunities from the huge amounts of growth that's coming from these fantastic renewable sectors, which these brilliant panelists have just laid out, and as they worry about having all of the stranded assets of the huge overcapacity of the fossil fuel system, so they reallocate capital. And I think ESG just helps with that, because it creates a moral climate in which that becomes all the more likely.
Okay, Kingswell, thanks very much for the brevity on that answer as well, but summarizing it terrifically. Let me thank our panelists in the windows here for some of those who have tuned in a little bit later. Jose Donoso of the Global Solar Council, Ben Backwell of the Global Wind Energy Council, Merritt Bromer of the IGA, the International Geothermal Association, Eddie Rich from the International Hydropower Association, Remy Gruet of the Ocean Energy Europe, and Mr. Kamaru, we heard there at the end, Bhadraj of the World Bioenergy Association. Excellent. Thanks for sticking to the times. This is one of the more challenging panels because we have people from all around the world and 7 out of whack taking questions. And I appreciate you all weighing in on the Q&A as well while you were listening to the other panelists. I do appreciate it. Thanks very much. Kingswell, excellent presentation to get us started. Francesco, thanks for weighing in as well. We're going to hear from the Director General at the end of the next session with his summary thoughts today. Thank you very much. I'd like to make the transition to the next session, and we've talked about kind of the 2 urgent priorities that IRENA has laid out during the pandemic. I've had a chance to share coffee with Francesco saying that they didn't want to miss this opportunity. Sometimes there's good coming out of a crisis. That clearly is the opportunity for the renewable energy space and those 7 associations that sat and discussed with us what was on the table this year in terms of the pandemic and the shock that we see, and that snapback in 2021, if you will, which is a big concern that is out there. Let me just open my camera here as we transition to the next room and the next session. We're back online, but you can probably hear me. Let me introduce our next round of panelists, and this fits in squarely into the kind of the two action plans that have been forwarded by IRENA in 2020 and then going into the new year. Our participants are J.N. Swain, the Chairman and Managing Director of the Solar Energy Cooperation of India, SECI, with the Government of India. Sharon Burrow, the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Council. Gonzalo Sainz de Mera, the Director of Climate Change for Iberdrola, the Spanish energy group. Alan Hayward is the head of group strategy at BP, which has made its own major transition under the new leadership at the company there, which was underway as well the year before. And Barry Gardner, the member of Parliament for the UK. We know, of course, the UK is hosting COP26 in Scotland later this year. We have structured this in a Q&A session, which I think is a superb way to do it. I would ask for the brevity of our panelists. They know kind of the time guidelines that we're trying to live in the spirit of. This will allow the questions to come in from the Q&A and block off the time that we have for audience floor questions. We'll be going on here for nearly 2 hours. The first is the Q&A session itself. Mr. Swain, I'd love to bring you in first, if you don't mind. I see that you are online, if I'm correct. Yes, perfect. I just saw you come up. Your government has set ambitious targets to decarbonize India's energy system. And as I was hosting the Global Energy Challenge for CNN in the last year and a half, I had a chance to see it firsthand, the development, particularly in solar and bioenergy as well, with the aim to install 175 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity. This is not long-term, but by 2022, and 450 gigawatts by 2030. With COVID-19, renewable energy ambitions have been accelerated. Can you share where we are today with the government of Prime Minister Modi on making sure these stay on track? We have a huge challenge and strain on budgets, Mr. Swain, as you know, when it comes to COVID-19 and the distribution of vaccines. What's the correlation? What's the relationship? What's the impact on the plans for India?
Thank you, John. Let me just introduce myself. I am Jatindra Swain. I am Chairman and Managing Director of Solar Energy Corporation of India. We basically do the large-scale tendering. We are basically the market demand aggregator and a market maker for renewable energy. So India's target of 100 gigawatt, 175 gigawatt by 2022 is on track. Out of which 100 gigawatt is solar, 60 gigawatt is wind. Other than today, about 40 gigawatt of solar and 40 gigawatt of wind is already commissioned, and about 40 gigawatts is under commissioning. COVID did affect us in the commissioning schedule, but as far as the operational plants are there, they functioned very well. And there was an excellent appreciation from the distribution companies for the RE generators. In fact, our payments were never affected. And regarding 450 gigawatts by 2030, the plans are already on. The grid study has been already over, like what will be the how the variability will be managed, how the balancing will be done. The country is initiating programs to start energy storage, and also the hydrogen. There is a lot of buzz about hydrogen. It is just starting in the country, mostly around energy storage as well as on energy shifting. So, though COVID did affect this country, but right now there was a major slump in demand as such in the energy demand, but it has recovered. As in today, the demand for electricity is about 7% more than last year. So the demand for energy is growing, especially electricity, clean energy, and the demand for RE is also going up. So I think we should be on the track for achieving our target. Many people say it is ambitious. I think it is very natural. We are a large country with a large demand, and we cannot meet this kind of energy requirement if we have to reach the world's levels. We cannot do this with conventional fuels. I think it will be devastated. So we have to do with RE, and we are on track.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation and your first question round. We'll come back to you, Mr. Swain, of course, and I appreciate you laying out the market drivers here. I know we're going to be tapping in to hear from Sharon Burrow of the ITUC, but we will continue with our other panelists here. And I wanted to bring in Gonzalo Sainz de Mera of Iberdrola, which has made this commitment to decarbonize as a power company, Gonzalo. And I'm trying to get a sense of how realistic this is, because you have the base load here. We talked about the ESG pressure. You're a publicly traded company. It's of great interest to see the diversity. But do you really think that a fully decarbonized energy sector is possible? And if so, it's a good question for BP in terms of its planning and investments. What's your timeline, Gonzalo, for that?
Hey, hello. Good morning from Madrid. Thank you for inviting us to this interesting debate. So, answering to your question, we think that a fully decarbonized energy sector in 2050 is challenging but possible. And this is possible to a large extent due to the technological revolution we have seen in clean energies in the last 10 years. But not just in renewables, but also in batteries in the transport sector or green hydrogen in the industrial sector. So last year, we conducted with the consultancy AFRE a study to see the optimal economic pathway to achieve climate neutrality in the European Union. And its results are, I think, quite interesting and can be also extrapolated to other geographies. The first result is that the most economical way to achieve a decarbonized energy sector is mainly through renewable electricity and electrification. So the electricity sector, thanks to this clean technological revolution, is going to play a fundamental pillar in the process, providing cheap and clean energy that will help to decarbonize other final energy uses such as transport in a competitive way, and this is very important, and in a much efficient or energy efficiency way. As you know, an electric car consumes 4 times less energy than an internal combustion one. The second result is that for some sectors, the so-called hard to abate sectors that are more difficult to decarbonize, green hydrogen with renewables can play an important role as the best complement to direct electrification. So the challenge for those sectors that will have to renew their processes in the next decade will be to avoid locking in emitting technologies such as gray hydrogen and to move to emission-free technologies such as green hydrogen that, according to all prospective analysis, is going to be a fundamental vector to decarbonize the industrial sector. And we think it's going to be fully competitive in less than 10 years. And the third and final result that I wanted to share with you is that due to the cost reduction of all these clean technologies, that decarbonization of the energy sector by 2050 is not only a must, and it's not only possible, but it will be a unique opportunity to transform economic models to a more competitive, cheaper, resilient, and sustainable one with more and better jobs, and maybe we can talk about later, better air quality that for cities is going to be a very important issue, and health and more prosperity. Thank you, John.
Okay, Gonzalo, let me follow up quickly with your microphone, but I just needed a 30-second intervention. I'm curious on green hydrogen, because we had these conversations during the private-public sector dialogue in IRENA in the last few years, and the fits and starts of having blue and green hydrogen and the investment. If I was going to take your overall investment portfolio right now, how much is allocated percentage-wise, would you say, to green hydrogen for Iberdrola?
I mean, for us, I think we think that, green hydrogen is going to be competitive in 10 years due to renewable and electrolysis cost reduction. And we think it's going to play a fundamental role. We have just announced some months ago a big project in Spain of 800 megawatts electrolyzers to produce green hydrogen that will be consumed by Fertiberia, that is the biggest producer of fertilizers in Europe, and it will represent an investment of 1.8 billion, generating 4,000 jobs. So it's going to play an important role, especially for these hard-to-abate sectors.
Okay, thanks very much. And let's bring in BP into the conversation. Alan Haywood, the head of group strategy. Bernard Looney was at ADIPEC when we had the CEO discussion here in Abu Dhabi, Alan. And I think many, even in that environment, were pretty shocked because Bernard was saying, I need to convince the investment community that we as a company are on the right track. Have you been able to pull along your investors and your workforce to drive this transition? Because the targets you've laid out are very aggressive. And I think it's fair to say you're an IEC now, right now. It's an international energy company, not an IOC. But has the world been prepared for this, do you think? And the company itself prepared for it, Alan? Alan, can you hear me? Alan Haywood? Because we don't hear you. Can you unmute your mic, please? There you go. Yeah, Barry's saying the same. Alan, we can't hear you just yet. I'm not too sure. Maybe the technical team can reach in and liaise with you, right, in the meantime. So let's take that. So we'll just pause. I know you can hear me, but we can't unfortunately hear you. So we'll have the IRENA back end, which has been very helpful, take care of it. Barry, I mean, I'm sure you've even watched yourself as a member of parliament in the UK, what BP is up to here. This is a very important year because of COP26, the transition, the government dealing with the Brexit. And one of the things that everybody's worried about here is that because of Brexit, the eye is off the ball in COP26. So let's deny the naysayers here their moment in the sun. Can you share some views on how the UK has factored renewable energy into its economic recovery plans? I had a chance, again, for the Global Energy Challenge to do a half-hour special on the move to 2050 and the accelerated plans by the UK. What impact has the pandemic had on those plans and acceleration, would you say, Barry?
John, look, thank you. And it's great to be joining such an eminent group of panelists. And thank you to IRENA. Yeah, we've got very high expectations of the year ahead. What we want is, I think, very simple, probably as it's universal. We want an end to the pandemic. We want a successful COP26, and we want a zero carbon future. And they're all within our grasp. But we need to show ambition that is proportionate to the crisis that we're facing. So one of your chat questions that just came up a couple of minutes ago was about a new Green Deal. The UK has got this Green Industrial Revolution, as it's called it. It was launched in November, and it's an economic stimulus package that leveraged £12 billion, that's about $16 billion of investment in a range of renewables. And that hopes to generate 250,000 jobs and set the government on course to reach the UK's NDC that it recently announced, which is a 68% reduction in emissions by 2030. Now, Vivid Economics have compiled an index ranking of how green each country in the G20 stimulus packages are. And according to that index, we in the UK are unusual among the world's largest economies. Along with Germany and France, we have a recovery package which is on balance benefiting rather than harming the environment. Now, of course, that's just a polite way of ignoring the fact that the 17 other countries in the G20 have put together stimulus packages that are net negative towards the environment. And that, if I hold it up, I hope you can see the red is the bad, the green is the good. And if you've got more down below than you have up top, then it ain't a good thing. But being positive is one thing, the impact is another. So how positive is it? What's the level of ambition in the UK are the real questions. And out of that $16 billion promised,
only 4 billion is actually new investment. It's real money though. It's having a positive environmental impact. So if I were to chart it against IRENA's 5 energy pillars, electrification, flexibility, conventional renewables, hydrogen, and the innovation sectors, I would do it this way. Alan at BP will have seen a little flutter in his boardroom as the UK said it would ban the sale of petrol and diesel cars by 2030 and move more swiftly to electrification. But Gonzalo will welcome those proposals and our plans to move away from gas for our domestic heating, because Iberdrola own one of our largest electricity companies in Scottish Power. Yeah. And in our energy white paper, we will see the demand for electricity double by 2050, but we're committed to the decarbonization of our power sector by 2035. Now, that is a lot of space for renewables to help us meet our target of net zero by 2050. So if we look at increased power system flexibility, the growth of interconnectors has been an enormous feature of our energy transition in the UK. They not only give increased flexibility, they cut cost, and we reckon they could help reduce emissions by up to 199 megatons. The government is going to legislate on electricity storage, which again will increase that flexibility. And of course, we're committed to a smart system of planning with a digital infrastructure to be outlined earlier this year. So we will see more ambitious thinking around the grid structure with a more decentralized, interconnected electricity system. And that, I think, is really welcome. That's your second pillar at IRENA. Conventional renewables, well, guys, we're not famous for our umbrellas for nothing, okay? So solar is not our strong point. But wind power, well, there we do well, generating over 1/5 of our electricity supply, even pre-pandemic. The reducing cost of offshore wind has been the showstopper of our energy story over the past 7 or 8 years. Gonzalo knows that very well. Price reducing by more than half. And now the government has once again decided to open up its auctions to onshore wind as well as onshore, and that should cut costs even further. On hydrogen, in the energy white paper, it was mentioned 133 times, and we've been promised an entire town heated on it by 2030. As IRENA's research has shown, green hydrogen does have a vital role to play in the transition. Currently only 1% of total global production, but it doesn't have to remain that way. Alan may have more details, I think, from the government on how the redeployment of North Sea oil and gas assets can be used for hydrogen production, but the indication of a 240 million net zero hydrogen fund by the government, I think, should be very welcome. Finally, for innovation in challenging sectors, IRENA has pointed out in its deeper decarbonisation perspective that 3% of emissions reductions from energy and industrial processes comes from CCS technologies to cut emissions to zero. The UK took a huge step backwards on CCS a decade ago after the global financial crisis. It cut £4 billion that had been allocated for CCS pilot projects. They're now saying that they will invest just 1 billion in trying to establish 2 facilities by 2030. Frankly, I doubt that that's enough. Alan, again, will probably know more about how our offshore infrastructure should be the perfect complement to a major CCS drive by the UK government. So frankly, I think the response here is disappointing, as is our response to the circular economy, to waste management and energy efficiency. But I do want to let you into a secret about what Jatindra and I hope will be a major announcement at COP26. And that is something I discussed a year ago with my very old friend, Jatindra's Prime Minister, a global green grid initiative that follows on from Modi's announcement in Paris, where he launched the International Solar Alliance. So I think it's incredibly exciting times. The UK is up for it. We want to take a leadership role in advance of COP26 and encourage everybody else to do the same.
Okay, Barry, I'm going to come back to you obviously a couple more times during the discussion, but thank you for that. That was a very great outline in terms of the priorities for COP26. I found that the public buy-in My wife's in London, so I go back and forth between the UAE and London. It is incredible in the UK, and I think it keeps the government on its toes, right? It's a real driver, but I want to get to that in a moment. Sharon Burrow, I'm glad you made it to the meeting here. I know there was some technical issues, we haven't sorted out. I'll come to you in just a second. I'm going to bring in Alan because his audio wasn't working, right? Alan Haywood, I laid out the framework, and Barry weighed into it as well in terms of the transition that BP is making. I find it fascinating because if you're a traditional oil and gas company, and then you make the transition to an energy company, there's convincing for the investment community, convincing of your staff that's been doing things the same way for decades. This is less than a year old, and Bernard Looney's kind of hallmark gesture as the new CEO of the group. How are we doing on that front in terms of accelerating the transition as an energy group? Well, we can't hear you. I'm not too sure what the problem is. I hear part of you, but it's fading away, Alan. It must be very frustrating for you. So let's have you go offline. We'll have the IRENA team. They thought they had it sorted. It's not easy. Do you want to try with the headset while you're there? Do you have a microphone on the headset? And can you hear me, Alan, or not? No, you cannot. Okay, I'm going to bring in Sharon, and the team on the back end will work again to try to sort that out. Alan, thanks for your patience. I'm eager to hear from you. Sharon, it's great to have you back into the room here. You launched the Just Transition Center, something I've been watching very carefully since 2016. And I've noticed here in the Biden, Kamala Harris administration is coming to the fore. Joe Biden during the campaign, it's a story that I covered between the energy policies of Donald Trump and that coming from Joe Biden. Do you think there's momentum now to have the labor awareness as part of the transition? It seems to me that it's building momentum, and we're looking at 5 short years of the process. How would you classify where we are today, and then having that voice at the table to make sure that the governments are aware of the opportunity, but also aware of their obligation to do so?
Well, it is about opportunity and obligation, but actually, John, it's about trust. If you want to succeed, you need the ambition that Barry showed you is lacking, and you need the trust of people. You know, when you go from a BP solid job in fossil fuels, unionized, good wages, collective agreements, unions at the table, a great living for their families, to some of our offshore wind energy jobs, and they're paid half as much, and there's no security. And in the US, it's a terrible model, little benefits. We're cleaning that up, but slowly but surely, thanks to European companies. And I'm delighted BP's back, but you know, BP was in the race. So was Shell in the 80s and 90s. As an Australian trade union leader, I was talking to these companies about solar, about good jobs. And then we had this hiatus. You know the story. It's the same with CCS, Barry. It's a last mile necessity. But if, again, like dirty hydrogen and dirty gas, which we're seeing being promoted everywhere, if that's the con that we're pulling on workers and they'll have to go through the transition again to save the planet, let's stop now. Let's say, what is it we absolutely need for the last mile, but not just to keep companies afloat. So I'm a troublesome friend on this, ambition and people. And can I tell you, of all the NDCs submitted at the moment, 0. Now, you can say in Europe, they're off the hook a little because they're committed to just transition and social rights and the Green Deal as part of their recovery plans. But in their NDCs, not one mention of a commitment, despite in Poland, of all places, we got more than 50 heads of state to agree to a just transition pledge called the Silesia Declaration. So for us, it's a no-brainer. We have to get the ambition up. We have to get to a net zero future. Is that comfortable for people like me? No. Coal mining unions, fossil fuel unions, they're the backbone of their communities. But you can't lie to workers, and you can't ask them to lie to their kids. So we want to see just transition that does simple things. It has people at the table with employers, with governments. I might add, there's some great partnerships that we've been, privileged to bring together through the Just Transition Centre in heavy industry, in fossil fuels. But we only ask for a couple of things. We want a jobs plan. And out of the recovery, we want a new social contract. Of course, it has a jobs plan at the centre. Jobs, jobs and jobs. So they've got to be climate-friendly jobs. And for those at risk, we want no stranded assets for sure. Our pension funds, 40 trillion, we don't want to lose them in stranded assets, and we are every year, but we don't want stranded people. So talk about simple things, secure pensions for anybody who's at retirement age, or bridge to pensions for those who choose early retirement. We need income support. The Nordic countries are famous for it, with employers, income support, reskilling support, and redeployment support, real cash to give those people hope. And then in the Nordic countries, you've got about a 7 to 9 month transition when no one will be out of work for more than that. And then we actually need investment in sustainable communities. There are some companies, coal-fired power generators, who don't walk away when they shut down a coal-fired power station. There are too many that do, and they look at how they can invest. So all we're saying is make the commitment, have the dialogue with the people that are going to build trust. I can build the agenda because the planet's going to die. And you know what we say, there are no jobs on a dead planet. I can't build the trust and the urgency in transition if in fact we can't get the ambition. So yes, there are great stories out of the Just Transition Centre. And can I say, Iberdrola has been fantastic in countries like Spain and other places where we have just transition agreements, but we don't have enough of them. And they're only at the moment at the edge of the fossil fuel story. In coal, we need them everywhere. Heavy industry, you know, aluminium, cement, steel, passions of mine, but we need the EU and the UK now, have to learn to say both again, to actually be serious about border adjustment mechanisms, to look at what the platform of sustainability, decent work, and of course, you know, real transition to net zero looks like. And don't be afraid of the rest of the world, you know, chomping at the bit, because once the Green Deal has a floor, once the trade rules are set, including, we hope, human and labour rights, as well as environmental standards, others have to play into the mix. I will say Europe, and I thank our pension funds for this, with Dutch companies, Danish companies and others, helping our American friends cut the first MOU with the building trades in America about decent jobs, union jobs in offshore wind. There's progress, but we need a lot more of it.
Okay, very quickly, if I can do a quick follow-up with you, Sharon. It's interesting, if I take a step back, and part of the work that I was doing on the documentary series was looking at the European response to the pandemic. So you saw Germany, France, the UK even accelerated its targets. The Nordic countries, Denmark, I know it's a small country, but it put a very ambitious program in place. But when they put those pandemic restructuring plans in the transition to accelerate, did they put in the just transition language or not? I just want to be clear. Was it part of the conversation?
Not enough. It is part of the conversation, but not enough. And can I say that the city story is only just beginning. There are some amazing mayors. But if you think about what we can actually do in cities where all the supply and demand, well, not all, but 90% plus of supply and demand catalyst comes in and out of cities, you know, 6 to 9 billion on the planet by the time we have to save the planet. It's the story of the future. And there are great cities who are taking their responsibility, but investment is a big deal. And, you know, when I started in this global job and looked at our pension funds, $40 trillion, and our commitment to climate and just transition, scars on my back from everybody, and said they needed disclosure and transparency, you know, then not only did they fight against it, when I told them they had to invest 5% into green economy measures, because that's what the actuaries told us was the tipping point. This is 2011, 5%, it's a joke. They're at about 2%. And now I'm saying to them, we are uncompromising. Every dollar you invest of workers' pensions has to go into jobs that are decent work, human and labour rights, and sustainability. If the whole lens, if the whole transition lens isn't about people, their rights, jobs, social protection, and sustainability, the age of anger that's damaging our democracies will continue. So it's all about trust. And investment is a big part of the story, just as cities and, of course, the industry sectors are. And I'm pleased to say we're champions of the the sectoral push into COP.
Great, I appreciate that. It's interesting what you said about the cities, because we talked about the countries committing onto the net zero 2050 targets that have been outlined. Kingsmill Bond was talking about it earlier in the presentation, the previous hour, and it has been impressive that they're kind of taking the bull by the horns themselves. I'd like to bring back in S.J. Swain. I was in India last year, S.J., and had a chance to visit the coal plants. There is an abundance of that black material, and it's cheap. You can bring in cleaner burning technologies. And I know the policies of the government to diversify the energy source, but they kind of admitted candidly they're not going to give up on the coal addiction. Where are we here in terms of the cleaning up of the hydrocarbon fuel itself in India and the diversification of the fuel base? You have to unmute your microphone, SJ.
Okay. I would say that India has been little lucky compared to other developed countries where there has to be energy transition. We have to go a long way forward. So all our future energies can come through renewable energy. There is actually not much of a conflict. So our total demand, peak demand, stands at about 185 to 190 gigawatts. And if you have to go to the world standard, it will triple, at least double or triple. So there is not really much conflicts between the thermal plants. Of course, there is a standard capacity of 30 to 40 gigawatts, which will come as the demand improves. But future will come through RE, and we are very clear that it will come through that. We may not encourage much of the thermal, but yeah, the largest coal company in India, the Coal India Limited, it has already started thinking of diversification, using the coal for gasification or for polymers, and also using the renewable energy, whether he can do, they can create hydrogen for better fuel. So that kind of work is going on already. And we are working a lot on hydrogen. We have started the mission is being deliberated upon at the highest level. So it is not that only the electric vehicles will come and they will replace all these vehicles which are conventional going on. There will be mix and match of the two. So we are very conscious of the pain of transition that may come when renewable energy starts replacing the thermal players. So we are very conscious of that. But as a country, we don't see that threat because our demand is much more, will be much more in next 10, 15 years compared to what we are consuming today. So that's all I wanted to say at this point of time.
Okay, thanks, SJ, for that. Alan, can you hear me okay, number one?
I can hear you, John. Can you hear me?
Hallelujah, man. I'm going to say, I've been in live on television when that happens, and it's very frustrating, particularly if you're doing it in front of a few million people. We don't have that many on the line here, but I'm glad you could join us. And I think it's important, Barry kindly weighed in on the BP transition, but I think it's good to hear from you. And I'll just clarify my question, but won't belabor it. Do you have the team moving in that transition at the pace? Because sometimes you have companies at the top say, I want to do X, and the team's not ready to do Y. And number two, are you convincing the City of London and the global investors on Wall Street, for example, in Tokyo, that this is for real and it can make money, as Bernard was suggesting, as the panel we had at ADIPEC? I'll pick it up from there, Alan.
Right, thank you. And apologies to everybody, but thank you for bearing with me. So I think the first thing to say, John, is in terms of carrying the employees, very much so. In fact, it was the employees who in many cases were pushing for this transition. And I think particularly when we consider, can we get a new employee, somebody at the start of his or her career, what are they looking for? They want to know that they're joining an industry which has a long-term future, which also has a participation in society. We've all got friends and family, we've all got children in my case. We want to know that we are part of a long-term solution. So this concept of the energy transition and how a company like BP can play a part in that transition, I think is actually very energizing to the employee. And we're seeing the evidence of it, that now people want to come and join us and be part of that transition. Second part of your question is, what do the investors say? And I think the first observation I would make, and I think Gonzalo was making this point and Barry was making this point,
There is a huge business opportunity here. I mean, that's the first thing to recognize, that this is a question of a value proposition. So we put out a value proposition. Yes, it's true that in February, we outlined an ambition to get to net zero by 2050 or sooner. And then in August, we outlined how we were going to do that. And that's the energy transition which we're in. So about committing more of our investment, more of our energy to low carbon activity, and creating an investor proposition, which we believe is attractive. Now, it's a matter of firstly recognizing that we're not standing still. No, we're not at a standing start. We already do a number of these things, not at the scale which we will intend to. Secondly, we will redeploy capital from our traditional hydrocarbon businesses. They're still important, but we will redeploy capital. We've talked about going from $500 million in 2019 to 10 times that in 2030. And we need to build the skills necessary. So commitment to renewable energy, commitment to biofuels, commitment to hydrogen, because this is what the customer is asking for. We have many of the skills necessary. In some cases, we need to acquire those skills, either those new employees, by retraining our current staff, or by partnering with other people, as we've done, for instance, with Equinor in offshore wind. So I think it's a transition which is very, very much supported and encouraged by the employee, understood by the investor. But of course, the investor said, let's see you do it. So we're into execution mode now, John.
Okay, very good. I'll obviously come back to you, Alan, with a couple of other questions on this front. I'm going to come to our friends at Iberdrola and Gonzalo. If you take a step back and you look at the kind of action plans that have been proposed by IRENA as priorities in this pandemic, one of them is what Sharon was talking about, that is making a transition a just one, where people have access to good jobs and are protected. And another one is to make sure nobody's left behind when it comes to access to energy and some of the challenges we've seen around the world. No less in India, right, with different challenges. Pakistan had outages as well this year. Australia, California, the state of California, a G6 economy on its own, having the same problem. The other action plan is to drive the green economy in line with the broader climate objectives. And Barry can weigh into this, but let's go to Gonzalo first. Give us concretely, from your corporate standpoint, what should governments be doing that dovetail the strategies here to accelerate the transition for a company of your scale, Gonzalo? What are you looking for, not just in Spain, but in other places? Everybody talks about it as a kind of a slug line, but what's reality?
John, my view, or our view, is that we have the technology. Companies like us, we are ready to invest and generate employment, and good employment. And we think there is also the financial appetite to fund investment. So what we really need are policies. Policies are a key driver. They transform society and the behavior of citizens, and of course the behavior of firms. So to guide this huge investment process towards a decarbonized energy sector, we need clear objectives from countries, from cities, and policies. And we need policies, all kinds of policies. We need taxation policies based on the polluter pays principle, smart industrial policies, for instance, for a scale-up, technologies like green hydrogen. We need just transition policies. I agree with Sharon that this is a basic element, because there won't be any transition if we don't have a perfect transition. We need a streamlined deployment awareness. And I would like to stress the need to make policy framework robust and consistent. So they need to be ambitious and consistent across a broad range of areas and reinforce each other. So we need a consistent policy framework. And the final thing is that we need those policies, to have those policies in an urgent manner. We need the fastest policy rate on application of these policies, because we need to act now. We cannot wait another 2 or 3 years. We need policies now to start investment, and the right investment now.
Okay, good. Let me bring Barry in. And it's historically, the UK has been a substantial oil and gas player. We've had a chance to witness it for the last 3 or 4 decades. How can the legislators address the transition here that brings in, and you were nodding when Sharon was talking about the labor component, the desire by the public population to accelerate the transition and deal with climate issues? How do you dovetail the two, Barry? If I was going to say, what's the responsibility of government to get it right?
Yeah, how do we work with the oil and gas sector? Forgive the bell in the background. There's a vote, but I don't need to go for it. Okay, I think government and the sector working together, very simple. You lock Alan and me in a room, a dark room, preferably with some cold towels, and you tell us that we can only come out once we've agreed upon a solution, okay? So let me set out some principles, and I was nodding away when Gonzalo was talking. First, realism on both sides. From industry about the scale of the climate crisis, and from legislators about the commercial realities of running a business. Second, certainty. Legislators should be clear about their objectives and their targets. They should set the rules and then stick to them. So it's a no surprises relationship. There's nothing that frustrates industry more than government chopping and changing the regulations. Let me give you an example. In 2015, the UK government cut the subsidy for solar power overnight. It actually cut it in the middle of holding a consultation about it. So nobody was prepared. The result, industry's plans were thrown into chaos, and Sharon, I'm sure, will recall that resulted in 12,000 jobs lost in that industry. So government has to understand investment cycles. We set regulations and targets, and then industry makes investment on the strength of them. If we suddenly change our minds, that investment is totally screwed up. But there's a quid pro quo for that certainty, it seems to me, on the side of industry. Industry has to be transparent. So don't wait for governments to insist on mandatory reporting on climate risk and all aspects of environmental sustainability. Do it. Be upfront about it and drive it down your supply chain. Don't try to game the system. Be open and transparent about things. And again, let me give you an example. Last year, after quarterly losses of about 7 billion, BP cut its dividend in half and committed to a 20-fold increase in renewables production and a 40% reduction in oil and gas production by 2030 to meet its emission reduction targets. Great. Everybody can cheer. No. Because that well-publicized 40% cut in oil and gas production failed to mention that it didn't include BP's stake in Rosneft, the Russian oil and gas company, and that equated to 30% of their emissions. So don't bullshit us, be transparent. Look at the climate crisis. It means that we all have to change faster than we ever thought possible. And interestingly, I think COVID has been an education in that respect. It's shown us that we can effect huge change in society and behavior much faster than we ever thought possible. And the fossil fuel sector is now under enormous pressure for change, with oil prices hitting a 21-year low as a result of the pandemic, an increasing awareness not only of stranded assets that Gonzalo was talking about, but of financial risks from the climate change highlighted by the TCFD. And in the UK, my party recently called for mandatory reporting of climate-related financial risks, aligned to the TCFD recommendations for all listed companies. Now, the UK government is now taking that forward. Other governments need to do the same. There are also legal risks that boards are growing much, much more concerned by. In the 1920s, nobody sitting on a board ever imagined that we would see tobacco companies taken to court for killing people. Now you have the spectre of litigation from environmental NGOs and the risk of losing your customers' trust and support. Again, Sharon absolutely pinpointed the importance of trust in this whole debate. It's about maintaining your social license to operate. And that's where shareholders come in. Iberdrola scores at level 4 on the Transition Pathway Initiative for Management Quality, and its current carbon performance is aligned to the 2-degree goals of the Paris Agreement. The TPI is a game changer in this respect. It gives investors the tools they need to make much better informed judgments. So the stakes are high, with increasing pressure to keep within the 1.5 degree, $900 billion of oil and gas assets, 1/3 of the current value of the majors, could become stranded. That is a dilemma for companies like Allen's, like Gonzalo's, and it's a huge question for their investors. So I think companies need an honest, transparent engagement strategy. I think governments need to work with those companies to develop a just transition to the new post-carbon economy. The IEA Sustainable Development Scenario for decarbonization projects is still predicated upon 66.7 million barrels of global liquids in 2040. That's only a 30% drop from 2018. So we certainly need to work with the sector on CCS, but they need to be much clearer about leveraging support for the rapid investment in renewable power, the electrification of transport, the energy efficiency. These are the elements where we need that investment. And fossil fuel companies have expertise, infrastructure, manpower. Let's use those to develop energy efficiency solutions, to expand electric vehicle charging and green hydrogen. The companies who commit to the transition will survive. But in an age of laser printers, you can't go on manufacturing typewriter ribbons and hope to survive.
Okay, Barry, thanks very much. I think it's fair to bring in Alan here. He talked about the Rosneft example. You've laid out a 40% target in production, but didn't include the investment, and actually a very lucrative investment that you had in return in Rosneft. In this transition, Alan Hayward, does BP need to be more transparent, or is it a cheap shot by the Member of Parliament, Mr. Gardner?
I think transparency is very important here, John, and so many of the things which Barry said, I recognize. I think, you laid out a plan, Barry, which I would agree with, in terms of there needs to be recognition of the issue. And, back in February, when Bernard Looney came in as the chief executive, he said, we needed to recognize that the world was on an unsustainable path. And that was why BP said, as have others, many in cities, in corporates, in countries, have committed to net zero, in our case, by 2050 or sooner. So that recognition of the issue, but also the recognition of the opportunity, which we've been outlining in this conversation. And that's really important. So it gives rise to this concept of a transition. And I think that's really important, that a company like ours needs to transition from what we were, the IOC, to what we will be, the IEC. We need to be transparent about the nature of transition, and that is why we put out significant number of targets for 2025 and the aims and the ambitions we have in 2030 and 2050. And we know that we need to deliver on those targets. So by having that level of clarity, by outlining how we'll do it, we'll be able to show step by step the trajectory we are on to achieve our targets. I think the point Barry made about certainty is critical, because this is a collaboration between all the stakeholders, and government and policy is critical. And what industry tends to like and manage with best is certainty and consistency. So we will work with government, for instance, in Teesside, in Humberside, in the industrial regions of the UK and in other countries, to start building industrial parks, to get into the, Barry, when I first tried to get onto the line, you were talking about the North Sea. And so taking some of those skills, but taking the natural gas from the North Sea, decarbonising it in the form of blue hydrogen, creating industrial parks in Humberside to help the hard to abate industrial sectors. Government helps on that. And I think it's this recognition, John, of there is a transition. Companies from the oil and gas sector need to recognise that there is a transition, and outline what they're going to do, and then deliver that transition. And the transparency, I think, is very, very important. So I encourage, and the fact that there are people, TPI has been mentioned, the fact that there are people who are looking to provide clarity and interpretation around people's transparency, I think that's to the good.
Okay, thanks. We're going to wrap up this roundtable questions and then have some interventions from the floor. But I'm going to ask Sharon and Barry to deal with the same question I'm going to deliver here. And I'm going to ask you to do it a minute each because I want to stick on the timeline. I read an interesting piece in The Guardian that my wife forwarded to me last night from London. Wayne, this group of 17 scientists using 150 studies in the frontiers for conservation science. And it was extraordinary. And the reason I wanted to bring it up, they said there's a ghastly future of mass extinction because of the lack of biodiversity, declining health, climate disruption, the pace to stick to the Paris agreements slipping badly, and quoting them again, the mainstream not grasping the magnitude of the challenge today, the mainstream not grasping the magnitude of the challenge. Do we have this huge disconnect, what industry is capable of wanting to do, what policymakers want to do, what the trade unions want to do, and then the challenge that's right in front of us? Are we just acting way too slowly? How does it play into COP26? Barry, do you want to start? And then Sharon, but I'm going to ask just for a minute each, please.
Wow, okay. Look, governments have an obligation to support the just transition, to leverage the skills and expertise of the fossil fuel sector, workforce, and deploy them meaningfully and securely in the green energy of the future, okay? A just transition is about the number of jobs, yes. It's about the quality of those jobs, but it can go further. And actually, if you look at IRENA's research, it suggests that the proportion of women in the renewable sector is higher than in oil and gas, yet 75% of women see barriers to women's entry and advancement in the sector. That's a key issue. So actually, this transition is an opportunity to do things for gender equality as well. And the key question that you mentioned there, biodiversity. We are transitioning government's accounting frameworks now so that they account for natural capital and wealth instead of simply GDP and economic productivity. That's the transformation that is happening. And if you look at the Dasgupta report that is coming out, the final review this month, that's what it's all about. And it's about looking at the value, the wealth that we have and that we are depleting, that we are not managing properly. And the transition must not simply look at the economic GDP numbers. It has to look at how it's impacting on biodiversity, how it's looking at all our natural ecosystems and our natural wealth. Natural capital is the phrase of the future.
Okay, so Barry, thanks very much. Yeah, Sharon, I'm just going to say, aren't we woefully behind this process? I'm, a father of 2 children. Alan said he has children, as many on the table, I'm sure, do the same. I mean, I'm actually getting to the stage of panic, to be honest with you, because it seems like we're so far behind the curve. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I'd love to have you weigh in. Thanks.
No, people should be panicking. I read my first IPCC report in 2000 and it read like a horror movie, and every year since, and yet you couldn't get it through to people. And so I was the most unpopular trade union leader for a very long time, except in key sectors. But I just say, Barry, tick, tick, tick. But it's about the business model. And this is where we're failing. The business model, great people, made lots of capital and wealth and gave lots of jobs, but it was a model that's destroyed the planetary boundaries or put most of them at risk, created the tipping points and given us the climate emergency. We need business leaders not to be timid. And I would say to Alan, I said it before when you're off, yay, it's great BP's back, but I want to see where you get from dirty gas and hydrogen to clean gas and hydrogen, and what's the transition period for that? Otherwise, we will have the same depressive story just down the track and we'll still be behind. So that article should wake people up and say, okay, guys, we're all on the team. It's painful, but it's also doable. And by the way, every dollar invested in a net zero future is jobs, jobs, and jobs. And if we needed jobs, decent wages and social protection right now to get us through this recovery to any form of trust in a net zero frame, it's now. So business is absolutely the key, but governments who ignore their responsibilities at their peril will simply create more of this. And Barry's right. Beyond GDP, what are governments going to say they're accountable for to people? And then what's the business model and the certainty and all the rest of it that comes with appropriate regulation and incentives.
Great. Thanks a lot for playing along with the timing. I appreciate it. We're right bang on time here. And this is where we bring in our interventions and also questions from the chat box. We have exactly 1 hour to wrap up. I'd like to call in the First Undersecretary of State for Research and Planning and Authorities at the Ministry of Electricity and Renewable Energy in Egypt, Ahmed Mohina. I saw him earlier, and I hope he's on the line here. I can't see everybody in the box. First Undersecretary, are you there? And if so, come on forward.
Hello.
Thank you, Ahmed. Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead and pick it up. Yes, thanks.
I think there is no permission to present my my photo.
I'm sorry. There's not what?
Okay.
We have you. Be cognizant of the time here, Ahmed. It's not a speech, yeah? So let's weigh in and get you there.
Okay. First of all, I'm so sorry because Dr. Mehena, there is sudden circumstance happened to Dr. Mehena. So I was pleasure to participate on behalf of him. I am Hazim Abdel Halim, General Manager for International Cooperation and Agreements in the Ministry of Electricity and Renewable Energy. Okay, now I think we will speak about the energy transition and the private sector participation in energy transition. First of all, I have the pleasure to take part in this important dialogue. I am sure that the dialogue create a platform to discuss several issues related to renewable energy and energy efficiency. And let me express my deep thanks to the Director General and Secretary of IRENA for their efforts. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is witnessing a new era in energy transition, which will require changing in the form of production and the consumption of electricity, especially after Paris Agreement, which was launched in COP21 2015. The main target of this agreement is to keep this increase, the increase in the global average temperature to be below 2 degrees. Now allow me to give you a brief overview on the current situation and the ambitious vision of the Egyptian electricity and renewable energy sector, and to share with you how Egypt succeed in addressing the challenges faced during the last few years. After shortage, approximately 15 to 20% of maximum demand, we added 28 gigawatt of power generation during the last 5 years, and we turned it from shortage to surplus. Currently, we are focusing on improving and upgrading transmission and distribution networks, including extra high voltage substations, control centers, as well as smart grids, with investment reached about $4 billion. Our strategy is relying on transition to smart grid, which will contribute significantly to improve electricity and reduce carbon emission, as well as reduce the investment required for infrastructure for electricity networks. Accordingly, in order to get benefit from Egypt's natural resources, especially renewable energy resources, the Supreme Council of Energy in 2016 approved the Integrated Sustainable Energy Strategy for 2035, which will achieve the required energy balance in Egypt. The energy strategy is being reviewed to increase the share of renewable energy in energy mix in Egypt to reach 42% in 2035. Egypt Integrated Sustainable Energy Strategy for 2035 is harmonized with the Egyptian Sustainable Development Strategy, Vision 2030. And
okay, so excuse me for just a second. Excuse me for just a second, because you're reading from the script there, which I can appreciate, and you kindly stepped in to substitute. It's a 3-minute intervention, and you're already past 4 or 5 minutes here. I need you to summarize.
Okay, I will summarize. Now Egypt is rich to renewable energy resources, especially wind and solar, that qualify to be one of the major renewable energy producers. There is about 7,650 kilometers have been allocated for implementing renewable energy project with expected potential of 35 gigawatts from wind energy and 55 gigawatts from solar. We have finished and adopting the world's largest solar park in the world, Bimban, near to southern city of Aswan. The total contracted project through FET scheme, 1,465 megawatt in cooperation with 32 investors. The entire park has been connected to the grid on October 2019. There are many opportunities for investors and private sector to participate in regional plan for implementation of traditional project, renewable energy project, especially wind and solar farms, and the development of electricity sector in Egypt. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry to interject as I did there, but I appreciate that. And it's an amazing shift that we've seen from Egypt in the last 5 years, particularly after the major gas discoveries in the Mediterranean, of course, but also to put the renewable transition on the table. Thank you very much there. Let me bring in Norbert Goresen, who's the Deputy Director General of the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature, Conservation, Building, and Nuclear Safety, better known as BMU. Norbert, your microphone needs to come on, and I see you're doing that now. What did you want to weigh in here in this roundtable in 2021 post-pandemic? And then I talked about the German model and legislation-wise in the transition. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for having me and having German Ministry of Environment here in this interesting conversation. I think I have two starting points to mention. One is, of course, the COVID crisis, which is the overall frame for this dialogue, which all allows us to come in with new stimulus programs to address, in particular, renewable energies. And the other one is the Paris Agreement and the need to address climate change. So in Europe and in Germany, we have set a target of decarbonize our economy by 2050 and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. And on that basis, it's very obvious that the energy sector has to play a key role. The energy sector has to become net zero as soon as possible, and renewables, energy efficiency, cutting energy emissions are absolutely the backbone of those efforts. And postponing all of those transition measures which we increase will only cost additional money for our business, for our society, for consumers, and for all of us. So therefore, we have to take the action now in order to take full advantage of the energy transition as it is and harness the socio-economic and environmental benefits. Let me address 4 key points for a just and inclusive transition in the energy sector. First of all, and I mentioned that the COVID pandemic reaction, the recovery needs to address the goals of the Paris Agreement and the SDGs, namely SDG 7. Continuing investing in fossil fuels will only increase our exposure, will not reduce our resilience and our vulnerability. So therefore, it is very clear the climate crisis has to be addressed when we want to come out of this health and economic crisis. Secondly, we have to set clear and ambitious mid and long-term goals, and we have to set a stable policy environment to allow for the necessary investments and to reduce the risk. So in Germany, we have set a target of 65% of renewable energies by 2030. And the debate already today is going on whether this is sufficient for the future and maybe further expanded. Thirdly, we need to swiftly implement these targets. Just setting targets is not enough, so it needs to be underpinned by implementation. The Renewable Energy Act in Germany recently has been amended, and it came in force, a new version on January 1st, and it will set again ambitious corridors for the expansion of solar, wind, and biomass, and provides the necessary economic incentives. And in addition, we have to continue with research and development and technology deployment. We have a new national hydrogen strategy, which in particular looks at green hydrogen, which is produced by renewable energies in order to allow also the decarbonize process emissions and heavy industries. In addition, we need additional investment programs and regulatory reforms also for the heat, transport, and building sectors. And my fourth point is we need an inclusive and fair decision-making process, full engagement of all relevant stakeholders. I think the process, how we decided in Germany about our coal phase out with the Commission, the Coal Commission is a good example for that. All major stakeholders, politics, community, science, NGOs, industry, trades have been included in that and have made the relevant recommendations, which then led to a phase-out, coal phase-out law agreed by the German Parliament. However, Germany cannot do this alone. This is a global challenge. We have to do it jointly, all together, to achieve the SDGs and NDCs. We will continue to work bilaterally with our partners through energy partnerships, through the International Climate Initiative. We are supporting the energy transition campaign of the incoming UK presidency of COP26. We support a number of multilateral programs, and last but not least, IRENA has to play a key role here, and as a global platform for international cooperation to provide the right cutting-edge policy analysis and advice in implementing a just and inclusive energy transition. And we will continue also to support IRENA in this work, and we're happy to already working very closely with IRENA. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you again. I appreciate both of our interjections from Egypt and Germany with its clarity and sticking to the time here. We have a number of interjections that were requested here coming in, and they're moving right along. Lamberto De Pra is the head of power generation for Africa, Asia, and Oceania. I don't see you in the box, but I'm going to call upon you, Lamberto. He's with Enel Green Power. There you are. Thank you very much. You know the time limit, and we want to adhere to that. Tell us where you advanced from the last year when we had IRENA 2020, right before the pandemic. Tell us what your interjection is.
Well, thank you. First of all, good day to everybody, and thank you for having me here. Well, in Enel, we had a quite difficult 2020, as you may expect, but anyhow, we succeeded to continue building and operating new renewable power plants around the world, which is an achievement we are particularly proud of. Because of course we are aware that electricity energy is that we generate has been vital during this period of crisis. This pandemic, of course, has been showing the vulnerability of our supply chains and highlighted the need for a more resilient economy. We think that we should take this time to rethink the global systems and to accelerate toward an economy which is, of course, more sustainable and inclusive. I heard this word several times today. Pandemic is not a signal to slow down, but indeed a signal to speed up. So political leaders, private investors, other stakeholders should cooperate to sustain a green recovery. Of course, to safeguard economies, livelihood of people who are hit or have been hit by the consequences of this pandemic. This can happen, of course, only through solid regulatory frameworks. I mean, we are all convinced about that. There are several proven models to which public sector could encourage private investment. So the key elements needed are, of course, properly designed and stable policies, are tools to mitigate high investment risks. We have splendid examples all over the world of this happening, also in continents like Africa. I would just mention that we are working on a new platform, which is called Renew Africa Initiative, specifically tailored for Africa, that we launched together with other 25 players and should be adopted by the European Union. But the key points are always the same. I mean, we are speaking each time: policy dialogue, capacity building, technical assistance, financing, risk mitigation. The key point is to create a pipeline of bankable projects that could be implemented. And this is the key point. Another key concept is that, these models, renewables, do not actually require government direct funding. Therefore, this will allow the governments to focus directly in dealing with the impacts of the pandemic emergency, and so allowing the short-term recovery efforts, while the medium and the long-term sustainable development objectives can be taken by the privates, according to certain models. So I would say in a nutshell that we should go on doing extensively and in a better way, to do the good experience that we have been accruing so far in many places of the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, Lamberto, thank you for your clarity. Rainer Heinrichs Ravweis is the Vice President of the European Renewable Energies Federation. I see him there. Rainer, do you want to pick it up there? And I hope I didn't bastardize your name. I hope it was a smooth transition to you. Ravweis?
Okay,
right?
No, you are very good, but not completely good. So thanks a lot for having me. I'm trying to stick my time. It would actually be Rainer Heinrichs Ravweis. Anyway, difficult enough even for German-speaking people. So first of all, let me say who I am. I'm the Vice President of the European Renewable Energies Federation. We're a federation of renewable energy associations from the European member states, active in all energy sectors and with all technologies. I think I have basically 3 points to make here, and this should be enough for 3 minutes. First thing is, I believe in this huge crisis with the huge opportunities and challenges ahead, we have, first of all, the necessity to get the priorities right in our own minds where we want to go. And of course, we need public support to get all this done, because there is a lot which people may be doubting about and which they may not be too clear about. But given that we have the Paris Agreement, given that we have the climate crisis ahead, and given that this will really require a huge change in the energy system, I think it's important to explain to the people and discuss among policymakers what exactly this means. This means to really accelerate the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and the best way to do it and the cheapest way, the most economic way to do it, is to accelerate the deployment of renewable energies. And not as in the past, mostly in the electricity sector, but including all the other sectors: heating and cooling, transport, mobility, industry processes, and to do this as integrated as possible, to keep costs down, but also to shift the system from the old fossil and nuclear-based system to the renewable system. So this transparency, where do we have to go, where do we want to go, and how can we do it, is very important. I have a short list of measures which I think is necessary for policymakers to decide and for industry players to understand and discuss with policymakers. First and foremost, we must make sure that if we channel investment into a certain direction, it must be an unambiguous and clear direction. We cannot go on subsidizing, financing fossil, nuclear, and other dirty industry, but we must make sure that at least public investment, and as much as we can private investment, goes to renewable energy, energy efficiency, and all the technologies which are needed for the transformation. To do this, it's quite useful and quite important to get a price on carbon, to get a price on hazardous products. And of course, it's also necessary to remove, where they are still existing, administrative barriers against renewable energy projects. More tricky, but also very, very important, is to develop and implement system changes towards renewables. This means, first and foremost, financial systems need to adapt to the different capital needs for renewables: high upfront costs, low operational costs. energy systems technologically have to move from the baseload logic to a more flexible system based on variable wind and solar, plus storage, plus grid systems. And of course, we need to make sure that those people, those regions who will be part of this transition, because so far maybe they are oil-based, coal-based, and the jobs are all in these sectors, we must help them to make the transition. But help them to make the transition means policymakers must be unambiguous in saying where we want to go and where we have to go, and then where public money, where public support is needed, channel it to a real transition from fossil to renewables, and do not go deviations, for instance, via so-called bridge technologies. We do not need any new fossil technologies, not fossil gas, not anything else, to go from the old system to the new one. I think these are the main points. Avoid these deviations. And if we manage to decide this as policymakers, if we manage to take investment decisions as industry people, then we really have a chance to move fast forward. And then we will have renewable energies everywhere in the world, large and small, rooftop solar and big offshore wind farms, green hydrogen, clean hydrogen, and we will have it in all sectors: heating and cooling, electricity, transport. And I think now is the time really to take the decisions, to communicate the decisions, and then make things happen. That's what I wanted to say.
Rainer, just very quickly, and a 30-second or a minute answer from you. That is phenomenal on the 4-point plan you laid out, but I'm in the Middle East, and you see Iraq, Libya, Angola, Nigeria, very hydrocarbon dependent. Are we downplaying the geopolitics of the transition, and should this be a priority for COP26? It's like, what's the payback beyond the contribution, of course, to the environment, to make sure that these people don't implode as governments? And I'm not picking on anyone in particular, but it's a huge issue, is it not?
Well, geopolitics in 30 seconds is a challenge. My answer would be definitely yes. I know the change from a fossil-based oil and gas export-import-based world trade system, world energy system, to the new renewable one is a challenge. It can be done, and I see some of the countries, particularly in Middle East, they are already on their way. This means two things for them, and I have to be short. One, of course, is to change their own energy supply. These countries, often enough, they have a lot of solar resources, they have a lot of wind resources. And of course, with all these resources, they can change their own electricity demand, their own cooling demand, and they can produce clean hydrogen and other green fuels. So I think if they gradually move their own economies plus their import-export structure, this can help a lot. This will not go without some unrest and some discussions. But I think, again, here, the most important thing is they need to understand, and I have the impression some of them have understood, others are still on the process. They need to understand the way forward is renewable energy and only renewable energy. And for the sake of the Paris Agreement, the sooner, the better. And also for the sake of their economies, the sooner they do the transition, the sooner they do the transformation, the smaller the negative geopolitical repercussions.
Yeah, thank you for doing that, Rainer. It's such an important issue, so I needed to flag it. I thought it was important, and you did so eloquently. Let's bring in So Yuk Choi, a deputy at the National People's Congress of China. If she can turn on her microphone, terrific. Thank you very much. Can you get that microphone? There you go, unmuted. As you know, we have 3 minutes for the interjection, and I appreciate you joining us. I take it you're in Beijing, if I'm not mistaken.
Well,
thank you.
I'm actually from Hong Kong.
Oh, you're from Hong Kong. Sorry. Thank you.
Yes. But I'm a Hong Kong deputy to the National People's Congress.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. I know I have to be very short. China is probably one of the countries that is doing best in controlling and combating COVID-19 pandemic. Being the first country to have the virus outbreak, there's no precedence, no experience to learn from. And China had overcome the challenges and problems because of her excellent leadership, good governance, and full support of the people. Last September, Xi Jinping declared that the country will peak carbon emission in 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Although I read a lot of skepticism from some media, particularly from foreign media, I myself, like most Chinese who live and know the country quite well, have confidence that the goal will be achieved in time. And to me, I feel more likely it will be earlier than announced. Reasons being the same: good leadership, good governance, and full support of the people. China's carbon neutrality goal is certainly not an ad hoc slogan. Actually, under Xi, China has become the world's largest renewable energy producer in the world, the fastest growing country in terms of green transport, green lifestyle, green agriculture, etc. Due to the time limit, I cannot list the massive policy changes and also a lot of new developments that lead to the setting of this 2060 goal. COVID-19 pandemic shows that we cannot rely on one single country to effectively combat it. It needs the whole world to cooperate and work cohesively. Likewise, issues like renewable energy, low carbon life also needs all nations to work together in a concerted effort. We as human beings, as Xi Jinping always say, we have a common destiny. So all nations, all of us should embrace and respect each other, irrespective of our color, race, religion, language, political stance, system of values, and so on. We must all work together because we have a common destiny. China and many other countries have already set forward the carbon neutrality targets, and this have opened huge opportunities for the whole world in all aspects, should it be technology, economy, and many others. All these countries, China included, have already stretched their arms long and wide to the world. I hope the world should respond and embrace in a similar manner. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your interjections. It's been a very clear roadmap that you outlined here. I wish we had some time for some questions. I'd like to follow up on your expectations for COP26. But let me turn now to Thomas Karlberger, board member of the Renewable Energy Institute. Thomas, are you joining us from Japan this evening?
No, I'm stuck in Sweden because of the travel restrictions.
I was going to ask you about that because it looked like there was some sunlight behind you. Go ahead, please. It's nice to see you.
Thank you. I think Kingsmill Bond put it very well. We are in a global transition, and the COVID experience has just accelerated what was already going on. If we look at the preliminary statistics from last year, we see that fossil fuel-based electricity decreased in the US, in Europe, and in India, nuclear as well, while renewables increased significantly in actual generation. China maybe had increased fossil fuel electricity generation as well, but renewables increased more also there. So as Choi just said, there may well be that China and many other countries will reach the target earlier than expected because of the accelerating effect of the COVID restrictions and the COVID economic consequences. This has also had impact on the financial sector because investors have learned what stranded assets and impairments are in the fossil industry because of the accelerated decline of the fossil industry due to the COVID experience. So there will be good consequences regardless of what government policies are going to be. As we heard earlier, there are just a few countries like Britain and some others who are actually successfully directing their policies in order to be constructive rather than protecting old industries. And I think that is one of the most important things from a public spending point of view now, not to waste money saving old industries, but use the money to protect people who are exposed by the consequences and to invest in the new long-term sustainable industries in the energy sector.
Okay, Thomas, thank you very much. That was very direct in terms of the interventions. And I love the way you pulled in from the other contributions we've had throughout the session here in the last 2.5, 3 hours. Let me call on Hans Olav Ibrecht. Hans, you're joining us from Norway, I believe, as a policy director. Where do you want to pick up here where Thomas left off?
Thank you very much, John, and thanks for giving me the floor today. This has been a really great dialogue so far, and let me also from the outset express my gratitude to Francesco and his team for being a key voice in these troubling times. I think that the dialogue that we had so far has really demonstrated that we urgently need to accelerate a just and inclusive energy transition. And also I would like to pick up the point that was made in the previous discussion on leaving no one behind. And also highlighted by Kingsmill Bond and other panelists, the changes on the way. 2030 is the reset year and market fundamentals are conducive. And I think this is a strong message coming from this panel that the market fundamentals are conducive to this transition. The key message emerging is that investments in low carbon, climate resilient technology must be deployed at scale, while investment in activities generating higher emissions and harming adaptation efforts should be phased out as quickly as possible. Let me offer 3 points into this discussion. We all know that renewable energy investments needs to be scaled up to reach the SDG 7 and Paris Agreement targets. We need to beef up our investments to the tune of about 800 billion per year. That's a tripling. And public finance amounts to about 14% of the total investments. But for us, it's a real concern that in the least developed countries, the share of private finance is actually less than 20. So it's the reverse here. And in sub-Saharan Africa, the annual investments in renewable energy from private actors are only a few $1 billion annually. So this underscores a key point from us is that we need to focus on Africa also. Another concern is that, of course, as part of this COVID-19 pandemic, countries are also now facing huge debt distress that we also need to deal with. Secondly, that has been highlighted by many that we need to use the COVID-19 stimulus packages to build back better and greener and to put us on the track towards achieving the Paris Agreement targets. We've coughed up about 12 trillion so far in stimulus packages. And as we've heard that most of this is actually going to supporting the fossil fuel sector. So if we can use and redirect the modest fraction of this into renewable energy, then we could use the resources to put the world on track to achieve the Paris Agreement targets. And then, as was highlighted by the previous panel, we need to use scarce public resources smarter. As highlighted by my colleagues, if governments improve the investment framework and provide clarity, transparency, and predictability, private investments will flow. And we also need to level the playing field by introducing carbon pricing and removing fossil fuel subsidies. Just to take one example from Norway, and we will achieve our climate target, which is reduction of emissions by about 50 to 55% by 2030, with a mix of different policies and measures. And carbon pricing is the core policy. And the Norwegian government just proposed to gradually raise taxes on emissions to about $220 per ton by 2030. So we need to use this recovery to stimulate the global economy and accelerate the energy transition. And this also creates a lot of other benefits in terms of job creation, improve health, and gender equality. Thank you.
Thank you. Hans, can I ask you just a quick question? I'd love to get the Norwegian view on this as well. You know, we have the presidential transition taking place in the United States. We talked about a Green New Deal for America, John Kerry as a special representative for the environment. Does this give the oomph and the urgency to the COP26 from the Norwegian point of view or not, realistically?
I think this is could potentially be a game changer if we can get back to the old G2 a little bit in terms of China and the US now are working in tandem rather than in the last few years. It has only been China, and of course we noted the announcement from China to be or go for net carbon in 2060. And of course, we are all now waiting for a similar announcement from the US. Of course, we are also now in part of the Security Council as of 1st of January, and I'm also responsible for the climate and security file, and I'm definitely looking forward to a changed position from the US government on the issue of climate change and the security risk. So we are quite hopeful, and I'm quite sure that the US, the new administration will actually end up on the positive side, and we can work together with the US as well as Germany, as well as the EU, and of course also China and other progressive countries. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate you taking that on the fly, but that's very interesting what you're talking about here, the link between security and climate, and that's the agenda for Norway and the Security Council. I'm pleased to hear it. Let's bring in Adam Bruce, who's the Global Head of Corporate Affairs for Mainstream Renewable Power. I see you there, Adam. You've got your microphone unmuted.
There we go.
Jump in. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Thank you very much for inviting me. John, let me get straight to it. I mean, despite all the challenges of the last year, over that period, my company Mainstream raised some $2 billion to finance the construction of new renewable energy power plant, including our portfolio in Chile, which was the largest onshore renewable energy project financing anywhere globally last year. Now, I'm not saying this to boast, but to provide some context for our discussions about the scale of the challenge facing us as we look to accelerate the transition to renewables, and to reflect what Gonzalo and Barry and others were saying earlier. And at this time we were closing our Chilean project financing last summer, it was reported that the world's oil majors were planning to invest $17 billion collectively in renewables over the next 5 years. Now, a tidy sum. However, this figure represented a fraction of the total planned investment, some $170 billion, by the same companies in greenfield oil and gas over the same time period. If we're serious about accelerating the transition to renewables, this massive imbalance in forward capex simply can't be sustained. And John, as you mentioned earlier, there are growing signs that the market recognizes this. That said, what I would say to our governmental colleagues here today is that if you set an accelerated trajectory to build more renewable energy, companies like mine and Enel and Iberdrola, who we've heard from earlier, will help you deliver those objectives in a just transition. But we know we need to do more. And IRENA tells us very clearly we need to quadruple the amount of renewable energy we're currently building if we're to meet our Paris Agreement objectives. And there's a very large amount of capital available to put to work in the energy transition. Considerable cost reduction in wind and solar technology has enabled us to successfully outbid existing coal and gas plant to provide cheap, reliable and large-scale generation. And as Rainier said, what's needed now is new market design, better regulation to accelerate the deployment of that capital and the construction of new renewable energy. And countries with a long-term plan for transforming their energy sectors using stable market-based instruments will crowd in that investment to deliver resilient and inexpensive renewables. And as Thomas indicated just a moment ago, in many markets, the electricity system is designed for yesterday's technology, usually coal-fired generation. And often the regulations that govern how the system works don't allow for independent power production or are weighted towards incumbent generators. So removing that institutional bias, better balancing risk sharing between the generator and off-taker will reduce the cost of capital and attract a wider range of commercial finance. And where countries like South Africa and Chile have set clear targets for renewables, we've seen very rapid investment, and regularly updated medium-term energy plans like countries like Vietnam add further certainty and help reduce the cost of deployment. So John, in summary, to quadruple the amount of investment in renewables to meet those critical Paris targets, we need to build the new electricity systems that will crowd in investment. And to that end, I welcome the leadership of IRENA and the opportunity for dialogue in forums such as this. Thank you very much.
Okay, maybe let me follow up quickly with you, if I may, Adam. Rainer brought up this idea of financial systems need to adapt because of the front load of investment, right? And then the payback afterwards comes with a lower operating base. Would you agree that this needs to be an education of sorts in the city of London, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Wall Street at the same time? Is this an awareness level high enough?
No, I think the market is there. I mean, if you look at, when I touched on the amount of capital that we've raised in the course of the last 18 months, I mean, I think the market understands the changing structures of electricity systems around the world. But many of those markets, many of the electricity, the regulation underpinning those markets are still designed for large scale, often state-owned entities providing coal-fired generation. So I don't think there's an issue necessarily with the amount of capital, whether it's pension funds or institutional investors or infrastructure investors. You know, we understand the market design that's needed. It's a question of accelerating that transition and looking at countries like Vietnam, for example, that's gone in the course of the last 3 years from a power development plan that was fully committed to very large amounts of new coal to a situation where in the last 2 years they've installed 9 gigawatts of new solar power. I mean, that speed of transition is really inspirational.
Okay, thank you for taking the question. I appreciate it, Adam. It's nice to have you. Roberto Vigotti, I see on the screen here. He's going to unmute his mic for me. He's Secretary General of Rest for Africa, which I would imagine Resources for Africa, and our friends from Norway as well. Roberto, we're talking about the need to have that focus on Africa, as well did other participants. What do you want to tell us for 2021?
Thank you very much for your invitation. Yes, I represent the Rest for Africa Foundation, a network of 34 international private sector players working, of course, in Africa. We do believe that the green recovery strategy, particularly the building back better for Africa, is the only viable solution because it can offer opportunity in terms of competitiveness, job creation, as we said before, value for companies, for the customer and the communities. Now, I think Africa cannot simply afford to any more investment in the so-called dirty, inefficient, fragile economy of the past. Otherwise, they are going to lock for several decades again the energy mix. I gave you 4 or 5 bullet points on our priorities. First of all, the government of Africa should combine public and private financial and non-financial to leverage investment flows in these climate resilient and transformative projects, infrastructure particularly. Of course, we all know now, finally, when I started, John, they called me Renewable, the Cinderella option. Now we're not anymore Cinderella, we are now mainstream, of course. And therefore, I think the public-private partnership is the key in this sense, because everybody speak about PPP, but really not much is happening actually, because the regulatory and policy framework in those many African countries should really be consistent to attract the investor and maximize this partnership for money. Optimal combination of project, quality, feature. Also, mentioned already by Lamberto, we are working on a de-risking instruments because the money is there. It's not a financial problem. The problem is that companies see a lot of risk not taken, even with the new instruments like scaling solar, get fit. Still, the risking strategy and mechanism to boost the investment there. And I think the Commission should do more than just doing this fragmentation of initiative everywhere. We also acknowledge the new business model that are taking place, new form of flexibility. Particularly, we are very strongly launching a program on digitalization for Africa, which can leapfrog the quality of their, not only of the electricity network, but also of the overall economics. Also, finally, as was mentioned, and we are working on that with IRENA, we are producing a flagship publication this year on social impact and job creation, because there is still the misconception that renewable transition will take away jobs from the worker. Trade unions are there, and also ministers are against. In South Africa, of course, we know there are 240,000 people working in the coal value chain. We have to convince the transition how to reskill this person. Finally, many things we say about renewable or sources, very few about grids. And I think, as the IEA said, the grids are the bedrock of today and tomorrow power system. And we have to remind that every dollar or euro we spend on renewable should be spent also on grid. Otherwise, we end up like in Lake Turkana in Ethiopia. They build up a wonderful wind farm, and after 4 years, they will be built the system to there. Again, that's a problem of investor, and the local utility are mostly bankrupt, and we have to encourage them to allow private sector to go and invest also in infrastructure. And so for the moment, that's all.
Okay, Roberto, can you stay on the line there? I just saw some news that crossed in my email box about Africa and the cases surpassing 3 million for the pandemic, and we're nearly 40% higher than we were in July. Does this serve as a major setback for Africa because of the strained budgets and the debt and the stimulus packages in the transition? We talk about a just transition, but if you're strained financially, will the private sector step up to the plate here or not?
Yeah, we are aware, of course, that in Africa, the pandemic, even though the number used to be less, they're losing millions and millions of jobs. I'll give you an example. Everybody talks about 600 million Africans without energy. Actually, there are 30 more million people who, even though they have access to energy, they cannot afford it. And so they go back to biomass. So it's more dramatic than we say. So I think that we have to, in fact, we cannot neglect the short-term priority, but that's why if we have a strong guarantee system by the institution like the European Commission, we can really attract a lot of investment to supply both in terms of generation, but also in terms of infrastructure, in terms of, imagine, John, the peri-urban areas. You see this city, half city is like California, half city is a slum. We need to track this one, and we only do it by private sector investing with an umbrella coverage by guarantee. So we have to think about the post-COVID, but I agree with you, they are now very much focused on short term. That's why we all together, the community should make Africa look forward and look at medium long term. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you for the interjection there. Let's finish up with Hans Josef Fell, who's the president of the Energy Watch Group, and then I'll bring in the Director General, Francesco La Camera. Hans Josef, thanks for your patience. It's all yours.
Thank you, John, for giving me the floor. It is a great pleasure. Yes, I'm president of the Energy Watch Group, a global think tank of scientists and parliamentarians, and I was years long member of the German parliament together with Hermann Scheer. You might know him. He's already died. We both, together with other colleagues, founded the first feed-in tariff law in 2000 for the world in Germany, and we initiated the IRENA. And I'm so happy to see that what we founded in 20 years ago, now the big IRENA association and cooperation and the big success with IRENA, I'm happy about this. So I want to highlight 2 points why we have to accelerate the investment into renewables in the next years very, very strong and very, very fast, much more than we did in the past decades. And the second point is how to do it. First point is we discuss COVID issues mostly over the impact into the renewable economy. But I think we should add also discussion about what can renewables help to avoid a lot of diseases. The doctors tell me most vulnerable people are the people who have lung diseases. And when we look to the lung diseases, they are caused mostly by air pollution. 7 million people in the world die by air pollution. The Association of Lung doctors in USA made a proposal to switch the mobility to e-mobility, 100% renewable served. This would save $70 billion in healthcare issues in the budget. And it would save also more than $100 billion in climate issues. Though to avoid air pollution with renewables is one of the most important impact for the healthcare in the world. And we should highlight this. It is not only, but it is also a point because of climate protection. Second, climate protection is more serious than we discuss mostly. 2 days ago, the European Copernicus Institute, a research institute, highlighted that the world stands already at 1.25 degrees global warming. And we have the target of 1.5. And last decade, we had an accelerating of 0.2 degrees. This means at the end of this decade, we will achieve 1.5, the Paris goal. So it makes no sense, and it cannot help to have targets by 2050 and 2060 with zero emissions. We must come much, much faster. In 2030, we should achieve 100% renewables and other technologies who make it clean, no emissions. And the question is, how can we go with it? And this is an important point, how to go with it with the best political framework. We have a discussion in renewable sector between auctioning on one side and fit-in tariff on the other side. We could look to the world with a new study, what we published 1 month ago with the Energy Watch Group in 20 nations. What is the impact of this? And we have a good outcome. Yes, auctioning is a good instrument for utility scale investment over 50 megawatt. But auctioning hinders the community investment of small and medium investment up to 50 megawatt. There is feed-in tariffs the best instrument. And though we should find a combination of both. And you see the examples, first in Germany, a negative example, the switch to auctioning declines the investment into wind power within 1 year from 5 gigawatt to 1 gigawatt. Onshore wind. But look to Vietnam, Adam mentioned it already, the feed-in tariff in Vietnam increased in 1 year the PV investment on rooftops from 370 megawatt to 9,400 megawatt. It is incredible how fast a community can follow when the right instrument is there. When the communities have the feed-in tariff or premium feed-in tariffs, they can increase it very fast, and they have a security investment, and they have a security of financing.
Okay. Hans-Josef, that was an excellent presentation. Thanks very much. It's also good to put into context where we are with the global warming targets and the impact on health, of course, which is often overlooked, and the cost savings budgetary wise, we would claw back as well in terms of remediation. I want to bring back in the Director General, Francesco Lacambro, I see in my window here. Francesco, we had a fantastic discussion with our second panel and the interjections that have come from all corners of the world, from Asia, Africa, Middle East, and Europe. Which I think has been terrific, and also a good, robust conversation between the Labour representative, Sharon Burrows, BP, the representative from the Parliament of the UK, of course, and they lead up to COP26, and that of the emerging markets represented by India and Iberdrola for Spain and its energy transmission plans. So as good, if not better than what we've seen in the past, and the same thing with the diversity of the interventions. What do you take away here yourself, Francesco, as we wind up the first day here and carry on to the General Assembly?
Thank you, John. So first of all, I completely agree with you that this has been a very interesting discussion, and make very clear how this IRENA private-public dialogue is a very important forum for building the future. Allow me also to congratulate yourself, John. I think it's extraordinary that you have been able to let everyone speak comfortable, and also to end our discussion perfectly on time. So we really had a very excellent moderator for this discussion, and I wish to thank you for being with us here today, and I suppose you will be also with us the day to come. So as far as I understand from the discussion, what could be a common understanding is that as IRENA has foreseen already in March last year, the pandemic has consequences on the energy system, as have the consequence to accelerate the path to a cleaner energy system. The fact is that if this acceleration may be sufficient, or needs something, and that's been said, I think Olaf made very clear, but also the other, what is important are policies. We estimate that there are still 10 trillion of investment planned from now to 2030 that are not helping to build better, but they are helping us to build the standard asset of the future. So it's very important that discussion like this that will bring into the discussion of our General Assembly, and may government and private agree that we need the right policies and the right way to invest our money. So policies are important, and IRENA could be the best forum where we will have the developed as the developing country. It's very important that we say that this transition to a cleaner energy system has to be a fair and just transition. This means naturally jobs and good jobs. We have not to lose jobs, but provide for better and more jobs in the energy system, and where possibly women are more largely represented. And we have also to work on something that make the north and the south of the world be less distant. So the call for Africa, the call for Southeast Asia, for the small island Pacific is a call that has to be heard. And IRENA is the best forum where all the possible voice, all the possible interest involved in this transition may be there and discussed. So thank you very much, all of you, for having been part of the discussion. We will summarize it. They will feed our General Assembly. Thank you for your effort, and please continue working together. We have to work together to succeed. Thank you very much.
Francesco, one question while I have you, and I think there's a window of opportunity, don't we think? We have an administration change that's dedicated to the Paris Climate Agreement, COP26 taking place later in 2021. We heard the UK position. Do you think IRENA can be a vital engine here to accelerate targets, accelerate that transition of the finance that's needed to not let this pandemic go to waste and to do what your aspirations are calling for?
So naturally, what's happening around the world is creating the momentum. So in this point of view, I really think that the COP26 is going to be a success. Naturally, we don't want to enter in any political discussions or any change in the US, but it's crystal clear if there were the possibility for the US to leave the Paris Agreement. And now there is an administration that wants to be in the Paris Agreement. And already they have talked about their goal of a carbon neutrality in 2050. This may create really strengthening the momentum for going greener and better, and for a more just energy system in the future.
Great.
Here's the window. We have to fight for it.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's an extremely important window, and I appreciate the dialogue. I congratulate you and the team for bringing the public and private sectors back together, and also the associations all in one group. We had all 7 lay out some very innovative presentations. Special thanks to Rabia and Stephanie and the team. Francesco, they did fantastic work leading up to such a large and grand virtual roundtable, which was very smooth overall. Thank you again for the compliments, Francesco. I look forward to rejoining IRENA on Monday, and I wish you the best of luck with the General Assembly over the weekend. Thanks a lot for the participation.
Thanks for thanking the team. I wish to do the same. Excellent job. Thank you.
Superb, actually, superb. Thanks again.